Welcome to Paranormal M, where we explore the eerie and unexplainable. Join us on this journey by hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications so you never miss out on any of our fascinating stories. Let's delve into the unknown together. Creepy Denim Guy. I went for a day hike up at Lake Blanche Trail several years ago during early autumn. If you live in Utah, I recommend this one, particularly during that season. Gorgeous mix of red leaves and pines. The guide says strenuous, but it isn't that hard, just a handful of steep parts. The trail is otherwise very wide and easy. Anyways, I was on my way back down and I was going through a steep section of the trail that has a bunch of large boulders and drops that you normally go around. That's when I heard a rustle in the brush. I turned to face the direction of the sound, thinking it was probably a deer, although something like a bear isn't totally impossible either. Since I've been almost run over by a deer by accidentally sneaking up behind them before, I like to give them a wide berth and let them know I'm there. Well, it wasn't a deer. About 15 feet away in the heavy foliage, I could see a person wearing a bunch of thick denim. Some branches obscured his face, so I never got to see what he looked like. As I took a few more steps, I also noticed that he was turning his whole body toward me. As I moved, he had his arms raised and hands in a grabby, claw-like position. Okay, not normal. The next thing that came to me was that this guy was a trail rapist. I'm not a woman though, so I wasn't afraid of that. I was more afraid that he would come after me because I noticed this hiding spot, or would settle for good old-fashioned mugging instead. So I leapt down those boulders in a way that would have made a mountain goat proud. I heard some loud rustling, but I didn't bother looking back. I knew that there was no way for him to catch me at the rate I was going. Near the entrance to the trail, I came upon two middle-aged women hikers and told them to rethink about going up because of what I saw. When I got back to cell-receptive territory, I phoned the sheriff's department about it, and they said they'd let the rangers know. Never heard anything more about it again. The creepiest moment, though, was seeing the way his arms were raised and how he pivoted towards me the whole time. Noped out like a pro. For some reason in my mid to late teens, there is a trend where I came across a lot of shadow figures. In addition, multiple close friends at different times would tell me that they felt a second personality growing inside of them. Even they would all confess that this second personality didn't like me. These friends were in different cities, unaware of the other situations. One time in particular, my girlfriend of over a year, who's never had a second personality, but did have this odd moment nonetheless. She was being goofy and jumping around and giggling. Seemed to be in a generally good mood. After a while, she kept doing it, to the point of exhaustion, where she could barely stand due to the laughter fit and jumping. I remember it getting to the point where I was thinking, okay, I'm glad you're in a good mood, but dial it down a little bit. As there was nothing in that moment to me that made sense for her to be continuing to do this behavior as long as she did. She had never done this before. Was typically a Daria low-energy type, you know? As she continued jumping up and down and giggling, it began to feel less like her, and I started to look and feel almost unnatural to me. I know it sounds stupid as I describe it, but that's how it felt in the moment. I tried to tell her, okay, calm down now, but every time she would maybe take a breath or two before going again. Finally, I told her, okay, for real, stop. You're starting to freak me out. That's when her face changed. She seemed devious, excited, focused, and aggressive. She got in my face, cornered me, saying stuff like, "Really? Am I freaking you out? Is this scaring you?" I yelled and begged for her to stop, on the verge of tears because of my previous experience. I was terrified. She stopped, and her face went back to normal. She looked remorseful, scared, and was apologizing profusely. She said that she did not know what happened, that she felt this feeling while she was weak from laughter and gave into it, that she wasn't in control. It never happened with her again, and she never acted anything like that before or after this. My mother's story. I've no reason to doubt her, and she's never told anyone or been concerned with the supernatural. She does have a vaguely spiritual streak, but that's all. Mostly, she's pretty no-nonsense. When she retired, she got heavily into family history. At some point, she obtained the diary of my dad's mother, who passed away perhaps 20 years previously, who we all call Nan. Nan had been very stiff and a proper English type, called everyone dear, used adjectives like terribly and perfectly dreadful, and was always relentlessly formal, and seemed to be slightly offended at all times. She was also an intensely private person, and never wanted anyone knowing her business. So one night, my dad was away and my mother, home alone, sits down with the diary and starts going through it. It starts raining. Nothing unusual, since they live on the coast. She gets up and closes a few windows, goes back to the diary. The rain turns into a storm. It gets windy. She goes to the other room and shuts the windows there. Comes back to the diary. A few more minutes go by. She's been looking at the diary for maybe 15 minutes at this point. Suddenly, the intercom to her right bursts to life at full volume, with just static coming through the speaker. They live in a 3-story house on the side of a hill that was originally built by an electrician, so there are a million lights, PowerPoints on every wall, and every room has an intercom. After recovering from the fright, she turned off the intercom. The one in the next room is still going full blast. She gets up and shuts that off, and can hear the rest of the house. Downstairs, still going, every intercom. She heads down to the middle level, where the master unit is, and turns the intercom off. She's heading upstairs when she notices all the pictures on the walls. My mother is heavily into hanging things on the walls. Big, small, painting, family photos. There's a lot of frames on the walls. They were all askew. All at similar angles, not random. Meanwhile, the storm has increased. The floor she is on is lined the length of the house on the side with timber-framed windows. Even the tops of the windows are wet with rain, which rarely happens and takes a proper storm to do. As she stood there, taking this all in, what she can only describe as an intense gust of wind rattles the windows from one end of the house to the other, as if a speeding train went past on the balcony outside. Instead of fleeing into the night in search of a hotel room and real estate agent, as I would have done, she walks calmly upstairs, calmly shuts the diary, calmly puts it into the cupboard, shuts the cupboard, says, "Sorry, Nan," to the empty room, and goes to make a cup of tea. The storm dies down. She writes all the pictures, and that's that. Here's the kicker. Someone from her work lives in the same street, like 10 houses away. When she sees him the next day, she mentions the storm. "What storm?" comes the reply. She's like, "What do you mean, what storm? I'm talking about the gale force storms we had last night." The guy looks at her funny and says he wouldn't have known if there was a storm since they had dinner on the balcony last night and there wasn't a storm at any point. Reading this back sounds completely made up. I can only swear it isn't. I lack the imagination to make up something like this. Shout out to Nan if she's somehow reading this. I promise I won't be reading your diary. When I was 17 years old, I went to school 1 hour too early. When I was 17 years old, I once got woken up by my dad, since he used to wake me up always before he would take a walk with the dog. First, he would wake up my older sister to use the bathroom before me, and when she was done, he would wake me up. Okay, now what's weird is, he just woke me up and I was following up my morning rituals, staying in bed for another 5 minutes. Then switched on the light, waking up fast and hard, followed by going straight into the bathroom, getting myself ready here, and going to the kitchen to get myself a small breakfast. My dad mostly came back in around that time, and I was done eating and preparing myself to leave for school by cycling towards the bus stop. So I did. I went to the bus stop, got on the bus, stepped over to the second, and finally arrived at school. But here's something that really blew my mind. My school was closed. I started wondering and checked up my online school platform to check if maybe they sent me, maybe it was a general day off. But no. Then I called my mother to check if maybe she knew what happened here. When I called her, she asked how I already was at school that day. I simply was 1 hour too early at school. I really got the chills because everything in my ritual really looked the same, beside the fact that I indeed was alone on the buses or at the bus stop. But my dad did wake me up, and after checking if maybe the wintertime changed, they do this in my country, turning back our clock once a year. In summers, we turn it back. Did I start to really feel like it was my dad's fault? But till this day, I really don't know. I just decided to go get myself a hot chocolate milk at the gas station next to school. I didn't really give it a lot of attention, since I still had to wait for my school to open. Now, 7 years later, I really ask myself, what's been going on there? I don't remember if I've even seen my sister that day. I don't remember that it was like an hour ago and too dark outside, less cars on the way to the bus stop, and on the bus itself, it's all vague. Sure, the last bus I remembered taking at that moment was pretty empty, and there would have been indeed more people on it. But I didn't even notice it. But I find it really disturbing that my dad woke me up. What was he experiencing that day? Being too early at work? I don't remember coming home that day and even speaking about it. It does feel like a dream, It's weird. Back in 2008, I experienced something I never did before or since. I'm only 22, so this happened to me when I was 7. I've remembered this for years, and nothing before or since has happened to me. I don't even think it was sleep paralysis. I was fully awake whenever this happened. And I was able to move my body completely. But, to give you some insight into what you think, demons, sleep paralysis, or ghosts? Anyway, I was 7. Me, my mom, and my dad, who are divorced now, used to live in this little gray house from 2007 to 2008. It was actually pretty cute looking, but my parents used to fight in it all the time, which seemed like it only started whenever we moved into this house. Because weirdly before, I only had happy memories of how my parents treated each other, and didn't remember nearly as much violence as what happened between my parents here. It could just be that I don't remember their fights, and that they took place before we moved into the house. However, I have a really good memory of everything else that's really specific during my childhood before that, such as our trip to Disney World that we took in 2006. I specifically remember no fights between my parents happening the entire time we were there. I can even remember the Kodak cameras my mom used to take pictures from back then. A white Disney-themed t-shirt that I remember wearing for the majority of our trip to this day. Seeing lots of lizards, me wanting to visit this one fake talking tree that had a face down there every day. I have a pretty good memory that's vivid from 5 and up. I even remember the specific apartments that we used to live in next to my mom's parents, my grandparents. Before we moved into this house, my experience I'm going to talk about took place in. My mom has always said my dad was violent and had anger issues even before I was born, when she met him, which I believe since to this day, he still has outbursts of anger. However, nothing I remembered was as bad as the fights that happened between him and my mom whenever we moved into that house back in 2007. There would be screaming matches daily between my parents, which I would remember yelling at both of them to stop. My dad also constantly go out drinking around this time period and come home constantly making scary threats toward my mom to kill her, and he would sleep with weapons, which he threatened my mom with as well. Around this time, I remember constantly feeling afraid and watched after my parents, and they would tuck me into bed most of the time. What didn't help was that they would always leave my door open, so I always felt like I was being watched by the pitch darkness between the hallway. My door at the other end of the hallway, where our spare bedroom and our family computer was. You could say it was pretty common for kids to be scared of the dark, but I haven't gotten to my main experience yet. It wasn't uncommon for me to wet the bed at this time, and I'd go wake my parents up and sleep with them as a result of my fears. On the night my experience happened, this was one of those many times. I only remember that my mom wasn't in bed, so I went to sleep with my dad. I can't remember exactly the reason why, but might have already separated around this time of year, or my mom might have been out. While me and my dad were in the middle of trying to laying down and going to sleep, I just remembered that I couldn't fall asleep that night. I was laying down, and so was my dad, but I just couldn't sleep, and at some point, I remember Dad's little TV that he had in his room flashing blue, making a static noise. However, I remember I told my dad this, and he didn't believe me and told me to go to sleep. Eventually, a few minutes, I started noticing what looked like these creatures to the right side of me, one waddling on the bed towards me, and some to the right of me on the floor. The one of them that was on the bed, endlessly waddling towards me, kept looking at me and turning its head to the left on repeat. Two of the same creatures were on the floor, standing to the right of the bed doing the same thing. They all resembled penguins to me, but they were all pure gray and black. They seemed to be made of pure static. You could make a beak out of the body shape, as well as wings. However, I can't remember what their feet looked like exactly. At the same time that I saw them, I was also seeing and feeling other things in this room that shouldn't have been there, such as I eventually started feeling the sensation of worms crawling on my body, and I remember that I could also see them. To my left on the wall, there looked to be what's hard to describe as a giant strip of lettuce. The giant strip of lettuce was lining the creature, and it was moving with small, little, skinny, stringy tentacles on the side, and like a purple mask in the center of it. This whole time I was telling my dad I was seeing some things, and that was making me nervous, and I was making whimpering sounds like a scared child does. But I remember he kept saying that he didn't see anything, and nothing was going on. I think he thought I was just fighting sleep, but I was genuinely seeing things, and at one point, I tried waving my arm toward this waddling creature's body, but it just went straight through. This all lasted for about an hour from what I can remember, before they all slowly start to disappear. To this day, nothing similar has ever happened to me since or before that incident, so I'm convinced I at least experienced interdimensional creatures myself. I later found out whenever we moved into that house from my mom's ears later that every single couple who's lived there has apparently broken up. But I don't know how true that is. I also heard that the house was built on an Indian burial ground. What do y'all think? I may have experienced back when I was a kid. It also feels not long after this. That's when I got stuck with chronic depression and anxiety and paranoia. It's still present to this day. Is it weird that I kind of miss the spirit I grew up with? Before I was born, my mom had been standing in front of the kitchen sink when she felt a hand on her shoulder. When she turned, there was no one there. On a different day, my dad had been standing on the same spot in front of the kitchen sink when he felt my mom hug him from behind. However, when he turned around to hug her back, there was no one there. Growing up, there is always strange, inexplicable incidences. I don't remember much before my teen years, but as a teenager, this spirit seemed to take a particular interest in me. Maybe it was because I acknowledged her. I wasn't afraid. My aquarium light would turn on in random setting on its own. And more than once I felt someone behind me when I was home alone. My bedroom door was also a little bit open every now and then, as if Mom was checking on me or someone had slipped into my room. There was a shadow figure that I often wrote off as being in my head, but 2 of my friends saw the shadow person moving throughout the house the same night but at separate times. My older sister came to visit once when I was about 15. She brought a Ouija board with her and managed to coax me into trying roughly at midnight that night. Once our parents were in bed, our mom never wanted us to touch the Ouija board due to really bad experiences of her own. Curiosity got the better of me though, so we set up the board in front of the kitchen sink. Soon enough, the planchette was moving to our questions. I thought maybe my sister was playing with me, but she's too boring for that. Here are some of the questions and answers. Question: where are you from? Britain. Are you a woman? Yes. When did you die? 42. When were you born? 4. Were you a mother? Yes. How many kids did you have? 2. Are you attached to something in the house? Yes. What are you attached to? No answer. Do you know who this is? My sister talking about me. Yes. Spells out my full name. Did you watch us grow up? Yes. Were you the one turning on my aquarium lights and such? Yes. How did you die? An unintelligible answer. At about that point, the answers became mostly indecipherable, so we decided to say goodbye. Other things have happened since, which I attribute to the spirit just telling us she was still around. I sadly moved out a few years after the Ouija experience, but I keep thinking about that spirit. She was born and died roughly 2,000 years ago in Britain, and was now attached to something in our house in Australia. I have no idea what she could possibly be attached to in this house, and how it got there. Apparently, when my family sold my childhood home, where all this happened, the spirit was extra active. My mom said it was as if she was protesting us leaving. I find myself missing this mysterious spirit that watched me grow up. My current house feels quite empty without any paranormal activity in it, and she was definitely the kindest spirit I've encountered so far. Probably the most strongest experience I've had with the paranormal. So it's around 9:40 p.m. I was driving home from work. I'm on my street and I see this small fluffy dog, but this was different because a stray dog or cat that would always run away, but this one stood extremely still like a statue. I've noticed he had deep dark eyes, and I start to get a bad feeling. So I honked my car horn to get it to move or react, but nothing, not even a flinch. So I approach the dog. I suddenly get this uneasy feeling the dog is staring at me, and I felt even more uneasy, so I continued driving, and 5 feet away from the dog, it started to walk toward my car. And suddenly I have this deep fear that there was something chasing me from behind my car. My adrenaline kicks in, my heart pounds. I press on the gas to attempt to outrun this thing. It is chasing behind my car as I press on the gas. I get this vivid image in my mind that it's an 8-foot figure chasing right behind my car. My adrenaline's still running. I look in the mirror and see nothing. It's dark out. I get to the gate and I immediately look back to see nothing, but still have that feeling that I'm being watched in the shadows of the dark. It's not until I've gotten home that I felt safe and secure, and the feeling of being watched is gone. I used to have a dark closet in my room, and I heard weird things. So back when I was younger, I lived in a big house. In my room, there was always this dark, dusty closet that I never used. To get to it, you had to crawl through a small door, a little smaller than half the size of a normal door. I never went in there for a reason. For one, the room was covered in children's drawings all over, words, pictures, and other disturbing and unexplainable stuff I'm not going to say. Oh, and a quick note. I wasn't like 16 in this story. I was like 8 or 9. So for the first few years in this house, nothing ever happened. It was peaceful. But eventually, we had to take off the door for a reason I forget. When my dad first took the door off, it was fine. It smelled a little dusty in my room, but nothing really happened. However, that night, I couldn't sleep. All I smelled was something rotting. I kept smelling this for another 3 nights. I didn't want to tell my parents as they were busy all the time while this was happening, so it would just be a hassle for them. I could only smell rot during the night, so I decided to go looking for what it might be. I looked all over my room and found nothing. The last place to check was the closet, and there was a pile of dead, rotting rats, at least 8 of them. I screamed, and my parents came, cleaned up the rats, confused on how they got in. Thought this was the end? Wrong. The next night, I was hearing creaking floorboards and something mushy moving in my room. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't fall asleep. The next morning, I found all of my dolls had black paint on them and holes in their face. I ran to my parents asking if they did it. They said no. I asked my cousin that had been over a few days before, and she said no. I didn't really have friends at the time because we lived in the middle of nowhere, so there's no one else to ask. The next morning, I had a smudge of black paint on my face. Our paint is still in the boxes in the storage room, so I was confused. Once I got the paint off, I realized underneath the paint I was bleeding. Not a terrible amount, but more than the amount from a paper cut. The next night, I decided to go into the closet and found a small white board with a heart on it. And that was the last night I was hearing stuff. It was weird and uncomfortable. For all I know, it could have just been a prank, but there are some things that I don't think you would do in a prank. Either way, I just recently remembered this and wanted to share it. It's not the most creepy story on this page, but whatever. Something is haunting me at night after 2 a.m. I live in my university hostel, and I share a room with 3 other people. It's an average-sized room for everybody, and we live with brotherly love, helping each other and every other thing. My room contains 4 beds, 4 cupboards, and 4 study tables. It has a balcony, and right in front of the balcony is the end of campus. And from right there is 3 buildings of another boys' hostel and a girls' hostel, but the 3rd building is a broken building, less than half burnt with no windows. Recently, I and my other roommate went home for 3 days, leaving the other 2 in the room. When I came back, they sat down and said something was on our balcony staring at us, and knocked several times. I thought they were playing with me, as they always do, but it was kind of unsettling because the balcony is all covered with windows. Next day, I'm going to sleep at 2:30, and I hear 1 knock on the window. And I was wearing earphones, and I just ignored it. Second time the knock was made, I saw my roommates, and they were in deep sleep, so I covered my face with a blanket and went back to bed. Next day, I tell my roommates all that happened yesterday night. They said maybe you witnessed that too. I thought no way it could be a paranormal thing. So I fooled around the balcony and sweared at everything out there knocking on the door. Then at night, they asked me to go where the knock exactly seemed like it was. So I showed them by knocking on the window. Exactly after 2 seconds, a double knock on the balcony door was there. All my roommates were staring at each other. Thought it was one of us who knocked as a joke. But another double knock came, which was the most chaotic feeling in my mind I've ever felt. Everyone switched off the lights, covered their face with blankets. The knocking didn't stop till 3:30 in the morning, and being made on the door and every side of the window. It still happens sometimes, But I investigated everything on my balcony, and there's nothing that can possibly make a noise except a mouse which died a month ago. And I live on a really high floor with nothing to be climbed on by an animal. And it was a very clear knock on the window, which a small rat or a mouse can't make. What is this? What can it be? Should I be worried? What should I do? What do you think this means? So I saw a hat man this morning. Just a tall shadow person wearing a hat. No discernible features, just a dark gray figure with a hat. Although I would describe the outline of his hat as being like a fedora. I was wide awake laying in bed when I looked toward the foot of the bed and saw him standing over me. I looked away and looked back and he was gone. I didn't feel any maliciousness from him though. It felt very neutral. This isn't the weirdest part. So a whole time zone away, the same morning, my mother was also awakened by something. She said she looked and just caught an arm and a hand. Then she looked away, thinking it was just my stepdad at the end of the bed coming back from the bathroom or something. But she turns over and realizes that it wasn't, because he's still in bed sound asleep. This is probably a half or maybe a whole hour before I saw my shadow person. So when I was seeing this shadow, my mom says she couldn't get it out of her head and that she needed to text me. And this was at 4:30 or 5 her time. She would never text me that early normally. So she waited an hour and then she texted me asking if I was doing okay. And I asked her if she is mostly doing okay because this is still early for her to be reaching out. We didn't tell each other about what we individually saw this morning till several hours later after work when we could talk on the phone. Experience at work. Hey guys, yesterday I had an extremely strange experience and I'm wondering if anyone could give me some insight. I'm a maid and a housekeeper for a residential home. So yesterday I saw that a house I'd never been to before was on my schedule. I noticed while looking at my schedule a couple hours later that my coworker, who was originally supposed to work the shift at this house with, was no longer on. We were cleaning a house together at this time, so I asked her about it, and she said she made someone else take her shift because she was too scared to go there. She just said that last time she was there, she felt uneasy and like something didn't want her there. She said that she was having a real bad anxiety all week knowing she had to go back to that house yesterday. This house was probably built in the 60s or maybe 70s. Recently, the homeowners had been doing some renovations. This is allegedly when things started to really feel in this house. I was also informed that a different coworker has heard someone running up the basement stairs at this house when no one's home. I was told that the grandparents of the family living there had passed away too, at some point. So I went into this feeling very nervous, but ultimately I decided to tough it out. When I walked inside, I immediately felt a super heavy weight on my head and shoulders. It was extremely dense. However, at the time, I didn't feel dread or fear, just a great heaviness. It was also hard to breathe, like you just can't inhale enough air. I was emotionally fine until about the last half hour of the clean. I was starting to get really scared, even though nothing was happening. I kept seeing things in my peripheral vision, but told myself it was just my nerves getting the better of me. I will say that when I mopped the floor near the basement stairs, I suddenly had an overwhelming urge to get the fuck out of that room, like fight or flight. I dropped my mop and ran out of the room while looking behind me so fast that I hit my shoulder on the doorframe trying to get away. I've never felt like that without a good reason, so I'm very spooked out about what could have happened if I hadn't left the room. As soon as I walked out of the house when we had finished, and even more so, I drove away, I could feel this intense weight lifting off of me, and I could breathe deeply again. So nothing really happened, but it was super distressing. The girl I was with there said she started to feel scared when we went upstairs. By the end of the clean, she had a splitting headache. When I told my coworker, who refused to go to the heaviness I had felt, she said she had felt the exact same thing when she was there. I told my boyfriend about this, and he suggested it could be a gas leak. That very well may be, but I guess I'm just looking for your opinions on this. Could a gas leak explain all of this? Or is something else going on? I work for a 200-year-old church. It's haunted. The church campus consists of the sanctuary, the office, and the empty, decrepit house where all the priests used to live that was later used as a meeting space until it was condemned. And lastly, a cemetery, with the oldest grave being those of World War 1812 soldiers. All of the buildings have stone exteriors. A priest died in the house in the late 1800s. He was old, so nothing nefarious there. But he still haunts the place, which seems odd to me. Since he was a priest and obviously believed in heaven, why stick around? When I first started working there, I was in the office with a member of the congregation who told me that on several occasions when they left the old house and turned the lights off, they would turn around and see lights that had switched back on inside through the windows. I believe in the paranormal, and I've had an experience myself, so I was intrigued. When I left the office that day myself, I turned off the lights. At the last light switch, I felt almost an electric buzz through my finger. The office itself is old, so I wouldn't have been surprised if something wasn't grounded right. Didn't think anything unusual about it. I went back to my desk to grab my things and lock the door, and the light switch I had turned off was on. Keep in mind, this was the same day as when I found out about the priest. I've tried asking him again to show me any sign that he's there, but he's never done anything else in 4 years I've been working there. But without asking, I've seen flashes of light in the dark windowless room. I'm not sure if it was pareidolia, but I saw a man cross in front of the headlights and disappear. He had dark hair and he was wearing a white shirt. I once unlocked the deadbolt on the door of the church, and when I went to turn the knob to go inside, something turned it the opposite way in my hand. This was during lockdown, so definitely no one was inside, and I ran. I've seen motion detector lights outside turn on by themselves. And when I've jumped in front of them, waving my hands, they'd never come on. I heard this one from my boss, who's a priest. The organist was practicing by themselves in the church when a pencil went flying across the room. My boss also told me that the members said that they've seen the priest looking out of the windows of the house. The decrepit house is supposed to be torn down within the next year or two. I'm not sure how it'll affect the priest. He won't leave, or maybe he finally will. Anyone else have any haunted workplace stories? I never thought I'd end up working at a funeral home. However, I found the job opportunities were limited, and when I came across a listing in the local paper, the money was too good to pass up. They even had an attached residence that I could live in rent-free, to ensure I was always on hand, since I was their only security guard. Sometimes the job can be somewhat unnerving. Being surrounded by death on a daily basis takes a toll on a person, but I remind myself that I'm here to keep the place secure and to make sure everything runs smoothly. Every night before turning in, I take a walk through the building to ensure that the doors are locked and the lights are off. I check on the mourners, attend evening services, if one is scheduled, making sure that they aren't causing any trouble or breaking any rules. I get up periodically through the night to make my rounds and ensure all is well. If I hear anything out of the ordinary, I investigate it. At first, I thought that the job would be a piece of cake. All I had to do was patrol the building at night, keep an eye on the cameras, and ensure that no one was trying to break in. Beyond the morbid appeal, this place provides the young thrill seekers. There are also chemicals stored in here that an enterprising criminal could use to manufacture narcotics, so intruders were a concern worth noting. However, As I settled into my new role, I began to realize that the job was more than what I anticipated. The funeral home itself was pretty creepy, with dimly lit hallways and creaky old doors. Every time I walked down one of these dark corridors, I couldn't help but feel like someone or something was watching me. Sometimes I hear strange noises coming from the side of the walls. Sometimes I see a shadow flash past the corner of my vision. Sometimes I swear I can feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. Despite my unease, I try to remain professional. After that, I am here to keep the place secure, not be spooked by every little sound. However, as the night wore on, I find it harder and harder to shake the feeling that something is not quite right. It wasn't until a few weeks into the job that things began to get strange, though. I was doing my usual rounds when I heard a noise coming from one of the rooms we used to stare prepped bodies in, their caskets for upcoming funerals. It sounded like something was shuffling around in there. I tried to tell myself a reasonable explanation, but I could not shake the feeling that something was not right. As I approached the door to the room, my heart started to race. I wondered if I was just acting paranoid, but the noise was unmistakable. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and reached for the doorknob. I hesitated for a moment, trying to gather my courage. Finally, I turned the knob and pushed the door open, just a crack, trying to peek inside without making too much noise. The room was dark, but I could make out the shape of a casket in the center. I tried to remember if there was a funeral scheduled for the morning, but I couldn't recall seeing that on the schedule that day. I listened for a moment, but the shuffling noise had stopped. I pushed the door open a little further, and that's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, my hand reaching for the flashlight on my belt, but there was nothing there. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel sweat starting to form on my forehead. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room, shining my flashlight around. The casket was still in the center of the room, and there didn't seem to be anything else out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I finished my patrol of the room quickly and made my way back to my apartment, trying to calm my nerves. It was going to be a long night. The next night, I heard the noise again. My heart sank as I realized the sound was not just in my head, but was coming from the same room as before. Once again, I decided to investigate the issue. I slowly made my way down the hallway, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As I approached the door, my palms began to sweat and my breath became shallow. My personal experiences have taught me to remain calm under pressure. However, this was a different kind of fear. I pushed the door open slowly and peered inside, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. To my surprise, there was nothing there. No people, no animals, no signs of disturbance. The room was empty, and the only thing that greeted me was an eerie silence. I stood there for a few moments, trying to make sense of what I heard. Was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? Had I been up too late? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I also couldn't find any logical explanation for the noise. As I made my way back to my room, my mind was racing with thoughts and questions. Was there something in the funeral home that I didn't know about? I didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but I knew that I had to keep my guard up and stay alert. As the nights go on, the strange noises persist, and I begin to feel like I'm being watched. It's as if someone or something is following me through the halls. Every time I turn around, I expect to see a figure looming in the shadows, but there's never anything there. I start to become increasingly paranoid. I double-check the locks on the doors and windows every hour, just to make sure they're secure. I even start carrying a sidearm with me in my rounds, just in case. Things just continue to become even stranger. One night, as I was sitting in my apartment, I heard a series of strange noises coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sounds grew louder and more persistent until they sounded like someone knocking at the door. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was probably just some kids playing a prank, but the knocking continued, growing more insistent by the minute. It was as if someone was desperately trying to get my attention. Feeling a sense of unease, I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. To my surprise, there was no one there. The hallway was completely empty, and there was no sign of anyone lurking in the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I returned to my apartment, I felt a chill blow past me into the apartment. Once inside, I couldn't help but notice the atmosphere had changed. The air felt thick and heavy, and there was an unexplained chill that seemed to permeate through every corner of the room. Uncomfortable, I retreated to my bedroom, hoping to get my mind off the night's events. However, the knocking continued sporadically throughout the night, each time causing my heart to race with fear. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the persistent tapping at the door made it clear that it was not. That's the moment when I realize I can't take it anymore. I need to find out what's causing these noises and put an end to it. The next day, I decided to talk to the funeral home director about my concerns. I half expected him to laugh it off and tell me I'm crazy, but to my surprise, he takes me seriously. He tells me that the funeral home has been rumored to be haunted for years, and that some of the staff have reported strange occurrences in the past. As time goes on, my interactions with the spirits are becoming more frequent and intense. I often hear whispers in my ear or feel a cold breath on my neck. Some nights, the spirits become angry and throw objects around the room. I've taken to talking to them as much as I make my rounds, really, as it makes me more comfortable, and I believe it helps calm the spirits. I've begun to realize that not all spirits behave the same. Some are friendly and curious, whereas others are vengeful and aggressive. It's as if they each have their own story to tell, and I'm the only one who can hear them. Despite my growing attachment to the spirits, I've still had moments of fear and doubt. There are nights when I hear something so terrifying that I just freeze in place, too afraid to move. But then a warm feeling comes over me, reminding me that I'm not alone and that everything's going to be okay. I started to document my experience in a journal, detailing the encounters I had with the spirits and the strange occurrences that happened each night. I've even begun to research the history of the funeral home, hoping to uncover clues about the spirits and their motives. I haven't had much luck yet, but I'm optimistic. Although my job is unusual, I find a sense of purpose in my interactions with the dead. I know what I'm doing is something important, something that no one else could do as well. And who knows, maybe one day, I'll even be able to solve the mystery of this place and help the spirits find peace. What are your stories from haunted hotels? When I was in high school, my mother was married to a man named Donald. Now, Donald was a drunk. He worked a good job and made good money, so he provided for us well enough. But he filled his free time chugging vodka like water, and always wore his underwear on the couch. Donald wasn't always aggressive when he drank. However, after a hard day at work, he would come home, drink a bottle, and try to pick fights with me or anything he could think of. Very often these fights would turn out physical, and while I was no lightweight in high school, on the first occasion I fought back and he called the cops on me. As a result of this particular situation, once he was about 3/4 of the way through the bottle, my mother took to packing an overnight bag, having me load up and going to stay in a hotel for the night. I always stayed in the same hotel just down the street from my house, since it would allow me to go back home before school the next morning after Donald had left to go to work and get ready. It was a nice place with a huge open foyer, and all the rooms were surrounded by 5 stories. I knew the ladies at the desk really well, as I was there 5 or 6 times a month. On the occasion in question, I'd gone over fairly late in the evening. The hotel had a 24-hour booking at the front desk, but the girl behind the desk mentioned that they were booked up all night. I breathed an exasperated sigh as I was relayed the news and mentioned I was just going to catch a bus. The girl behind the desk mentioned that there was a room she could put me in at a discounted rate, no less. She was, however, hesitant to do so, saying the owner of the hotel had taken it out of service for reasons unknown to her. but that she knew I would be gone before the owner would arrive in the morning, and she could fudge it in the system to look like the room hadn't been occupied. I thanked her for this and accepted, not caring for the other options I had available to me at the time. So I got the key and went into the room, got undressed, showered, and settled into bed. I noted that despite her reservations, the room was immaculate. I simply couldn't fathom why a perfectly good room wasn't being rented out, but I decided not to look a gift horse in the mouth. The room was pretty standard as far as a hotel room goes. A single queen-size bed, a TV on the wall to your left, a desk to your right, a mirrored closet door across the bed with a table next to it, and a ceiling fan just past the foot of the bed. I fell asleep sometime around 11 to the sound of the TV playing some late-night cop drama. Quite comfortable in the bed until around 2:30, I wasn't awoken by a sound as much of the lack of sound. You never really realize how jarring silence is until it occurs suddenly at night. As I rose to sit up, I took a note of the time on the alarm clock, and I noticed that the TV had turned off. The room was illuminated by light, and the parking lot poured in through the blinds as my vision sharpened and the room properly came into focus. I noticed that I wasn't alone. At the foot of the bed was a woman. She was wearing a hotel bathrobe. Her hair was darkened by water, as if she had just gotten out of the shower, and notably, was quite tall. The top of her head was just 2 feet or so below the ceiling fan. She just stood at the foot of the bed with her head cocked to one side and stared at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't even move. At some point during this exchange, I'd convinced myself I was dreaming, and there was no woman in my room, so despite her standing there staring at me, I wasn't afraid. I had just been having hyper-realistic dreams since I was a kid after all. So I simply laid back down and watched her stand there, my head tilted so I could keep an eye on her, knowing that if I waited, she would simply disappear, and she did. I fell back asleep and slept through my morning wake-up call. The lady at the front desk sounded a bit nervous when she called, so I quickly got dressed and headed to the front desk, thinking her boss may be coming sooner than expected. I wasn't expecting the conversation I had at the front desk as I checked out. When I walked up, she started apologizing to me. I was confused, so I calmed her down and asked her to explain. What had her so stressed? She took a breath and said, "I found out why the room was taken out of service. Come to find out, 2 weeks before I stayed in that room, a woman stayed there on vacation with her husband and 2 kids. She stayed behind while they went to grab breakfast one morning. She took a shower, put on her bathrobe, and hung herself from the ceiling fan with a bedsheet. Her husband found her there when he got back. The room was removed from service as a matter of good taste until the services were held. I didn't know any of this beforehand, and it makes me wonder, did I see her in my room? Was that her that night, or was it just a dream?" My parents moved into this house with my older siblings and I before I was even 1 year old, and we lived in that house for over 20 years. Strange things happened sporadically over the years we lived there. It got to the point that I refused to even step foot back in. These are what I can remember since it's been a few years after we moved out of that house. I was around 5 or 6, and it was storming outside. My siblings and I were watching TV. Every now and again, we would hear the front door close, even though the door was already closed to begin with. Our parents were already asleep in their room. After hearing it close maybe 5 times, I rushed upstairs and forced myself to sleep. That was the only time it happened. One time when I was in 9th grade, I woke up in the middle of the night. In my sleepy haze, I thought I saw a woman in her mid-40s with blonde hair. She was standing in the corner, but where a dresser stood as well. I blinked to try to clear my head, but that woman was gone after that. It freaked me out. I thought I was losing my mind and I was seeing things that weren't there. Now this event occurred when I was at college. I was home alone and no appliances were on. My laptop was running. It was basically quiet in the house. Then I heard 2 muffled voices, a man and a woman conversing with one another. I looked around the house to try to find out where it was coming from, but found nothing, and I was still alone in the house. Other times when all of us would leave and come back after dark, we would see that the basement light was on. This was when we all stopped going down to the basement long ago. At other times, the pets that we had would speak to an empty space or just maybe stare at nothing. After a beloved pet died, my older sister and I would sometimes hear something running up and down the stairs. My sister and friends of hers witnessed the TV turn on by itself. The remote was nowhere near them. Another time she saw a figure in the middle of her room. After a second, it vanished. She would see a figure in a tree outside her window, but would turn around when she changed her clothes. And of course, things would disappear and sometimes turn back up. Whatever didn't turn back up, just replaced or accepted that it was gone. Yeah, we were able to endure a lot. We couldn't move out because we didn't have a lot of money. My siblings and I moved out of that house a few years ago, and my parents followed. We haven't had anything strange or abnormal happen since. The Musician Ghost. My mom and dad went to a small Mexican town to visit the tombstone of a musician who sadly passed away. The thing about the town was how poor people were. No one would have casual, fancy clothes apart from two reasons. They're either getting married or buried. So my mom and dad got there late at night, and while looking for his tombstone, end up locked in. They keep looking until my mom splits up going into the building next to the graves with more tombstones. She makes a turn and sees this tall, pale man in a black suit. She asks him where the tombstone of the musician was, and jokingly said, "Wow, you scared me." He doesn't respond or look at her, but just points in a direction. She goes there and meets up with my dad. They found the tombstone in the direction pointed, and when my dad asked who the man was, she came to the realization that they were locked in. No one should have been there, far less in a black suit. The Crying Child. This story takes place when my now 30-year-old sister was 6 or 10. She was going to school and had left with my dad. My mom was inside cooking when she heard what sounded like a kid crying. She's not a paranormal nut job, so her first idea was maybe my sister got mad with my dad and ran inside and I just didn't hear the door. So she goes upstairs. Once upstairs, the cries stop. She thinks maybe she's hearing things, so she goes back down without checking. After hearing it again, she looks around this time. She described it as if the cries constantly changed from location, from the guest room to the laundry to my sister's room. Now in my sister's room, she hears it from her closet and thinks that it's right behind it, and it was my sister, calling out for her as she goes into the closet and turns on the light, only for the crying to stop. When my dad got home, she questioned him, but he didn't know what he had heard. The Mimic. This one is the most real, since 2 people vouch for it. So my dad and grandma had recently got home. My dad picking my grandma up from her house to have dinner at our place. At the time, my dad had gotten home from work and was dead tired. Knocking on the metal gate in front of our house, he yelled out for our sister. "Sister, open up the gate." She responded, "Wait, I'm coming." After waiting for a while, he called her again, now pissed, and again she yelled out, "Wait, I'm coming." The thing to note here is that, 1, the gate makes it practically impossible for someone to see inside. 2, the voice was clearly my sister's. So after waiting for a while, he now angrily calls my mom to see what my sister could be doing. When she picked up and heard what she was going on, she was baffled and she said, "She's with me." My mom had picked up my sister directly from school and they went shopping. She drove back home, worried that someone broke in. When they got inside, they found no one hidden and nothing stolen. An article I wrote about quantum mechanics to explore the occurrence of paranormal activity. Life after death is a topic that has been fascinating humans for centuries. While some people believe that death is the end, others believe that consciousness persists beyond physical death. In recent years, scientific research has shed new light on this topic, and it's becoming increasingly clear that life after death is a possibility. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for life after death comes from the field of quantum mechanics. The double slit experiment was done for the first time in the early 1800s. It showed that particles can be more than one state at one time. This means that a single particle can be both a wave and a particle at the same time, and that its behavior is influenced by the act of observation. This experiment is important for the idea of life after death because it shows that consciousness may exist outside of the body. Quantum entanglement and superposition. Another phenomenon that supports the possibility of life after death is quantum entanglement. This happens when the paths of two particles cross in such a way that their states are linked. No matter how far apart they are, this means that if one particle is observed, the state of the other particle will be affected, even if it's on the other side of the universe. Some scientists think that this shows the consciousness that may be able to live on after the body dies, and may be linked to a realm that is not purely physical. In addition to quantum mechanics, there's also evidence that natural elements can create energy sources that a spirit could draw and power up their own consciousness. For example, moving water has been linked to spiritual power for a long time and is often used in spiritual rituals. People often think spirits use quartz to re-energize. We know that quartz crystals can hold energy and be used in watches. They're often used in meditation and other spiritual practices. These natural crystals could be a way for consciousness to get energy outside of the physical body. While there is still much that we don't know about life after death, the evidence of quantum mechanics, the environment, and natural elements suggests that it is a possibility. As our understanding of these fields continue to grow, it's likely that we will gain a deeper understanding of the nature and consequences of its relationship to the physical world. Whether or not life after death is ultimately proven to be a reality, the pursuit of knowledge and the exploration of the mysteries of the universe is a noble and worthwhile endeavor. Moving water. Moving water has the ability to generate both potential and kinetic energy. Potential energy is the energy that an object has because of where it is. Kinetic energy is the energy that an object has when it's moving. When water is moving, it has kinetic energy, and when it's at a high point, such as at the top of a waterfall, it has potential energy. In the case of a spirit getting power from moving water, the kinetic energy of the water could be used to power the spirit's consciousness. For this to work, the spirit would need to turn the kinetic energy into something it could use, like electrical energy or some other form. Additionally, the potential energy of the water, as it's held at a high point, could also be a potential source of that energy of the spirit. As the water falls, its potential energy is converted into kinetic energy. The spirit could use this energy in the same way it would skim electrons or photons from a falling waterfall energy. Static electricity. Negative ions are atoms or molecules that have gained one or more electrons and thus have a negative charge. They are present in our environment and can have various effects on our health and well-being, including increasing alertness and improving mood. One way to generate negative ions naturally is through relative humidity in cold, dry locations. Relative humidity is the amount of moisture present in the air compared to the maximum amount of moisture that the air can hold at a particular temperature. When the relative humidity is high, there is more moisture in the air, and this can cause negative ions to be generated. This occurs because water molecules in the air can become ionized, resulting in the production of negative ions. In cold, dry locations, such as mountainous regions or areas with dry climates, negative ions can also be generated. This is because when the air gets colder, it can hold less moisture, and this can result in the ionization of molecules into the air. This is why mountain air is often associated with the feelings of rejuvenation and refreshment. For a spirit, these negative ions generated through relative humidity in cold, dry locations could potentially serve as a source of energy. The negative ions could be harnessed in using the power of the spirit's consciousness in the same way that electrical energy is used to power electronic devices. While this is a hypothetical explanation, it is possible that the natural generation of negative ions could provide a source of energy for a spirit to draw from, right? All of these are my personal theories, but I believe they indicate that natural things like moving water and static electricity could be a source of energy for a spirit based on quantum mechanics and entanglement theory. A friend and I were visiting a buddy of ours up in Lexington, Kentucky, for a couple days in March of this year. Our buddy lived with a friend and his girlfriend inside an old rundown house, and he had briefly mentioned the idea that it was haunted. But of course, we didn't pay much attention to that claim. The first night we stayed there, my friend and I slept upstairs, which had a staircase that literally couldn't have been any more weathered and squeaky. My friend was sleeping on a small couch which was directly beside the rails from the staircase. It was an attic-like staircase. And I slept on a mattress, maybe 20 feet away from him. He said he heard something pacing up the steps, and I immediately called to see if I had heard the same thing. I honestly didn't, but I couldn't tell that he was freaked out, so I wasn't going to completely disregard him. We mentioned it to our buddy the next day, and he just kind of laughed it off, saying, "I told you this place was weird." The second night was my turn to sleep on the couch beside the death stairs, and admittingly, I was a bit nervous. We turned the lights off and attempted to go to sleep, and about 10 minutes after, I hear something that sounds like someone sprinting up the stairs. I immediately grabbed my phone and turned the flashlight app on and looked down the staircase, and nothing. The door at the bottom of the staircase was closed, so it couldn't have been the cat that lived there. It's a huge-ass cat. At this point, I'm paranoid as hell and just telling myself it was the placebo effect. I was thinking about hearing footsteps and my brain just panicked. I still decided to pack my pillow and blankets and sleep on the floor next to my friend on the mattress. If I was going to die, he was too. So the third day, we mentioned our experience to our buddy. He was just like, "I'm telling you, I believe it." The third night, we decided to slumber party it up and bring a futon mattress upstairs and see what this motherfucking thing wanted. A couple hours went by and nothing. Not even the slightest sound that could be misinterpreted as pacing upstairs. The next morning, disappointed, my friend and I pack our bags and get ready to drive home. After about 2 hours on the road, I get a phone call. It's the guy whose room was upstairs. He stayed at his girlfriend's the entire duration of our stay. He proceeded to ask me if we moved any of his stuff around, saying that things looked drastically different than when he left it. I tell him what happened and how we carried the futon mattress upstairs and apologized for anything misplaced. He said that he had an item underneath his mattress, and that the mattress had been completely flipped over and some miscellaneous objects beside the mattress were out of place. I turned to my friend and asked if he had done anything, knowing already that he hadn't, because I slept in the same room with him and even woke up before him. I then called our buddy, that one up there to stay, to see if he had slipped the mattress, considering that I had called him an hour before leaving to see if I had left something up there, and he denied it. The guy who lives upstairs said they had messed with the Ouija board before, and the ghost said his name was Adam. Although we all never experienced a paranormal event at the same time, I'm still certain that there was something in that house, and it enjoyed fucking with us. Can someone tell me what's going on? Hey there, I'm a 13-year-old Italian boy. I always loved horror, and I wanted to do some live horror, but it wasn't as cool as I expected. In this summer, 2022, my sister, 20, started hanging out all night with her friends, and since we have the room shared together, I was alone at night. At the beginning, it was just fun. I stay up all night, and I'm watching videos and creepypasta or stuff like that. All of my dreams are nightmares, since I was a baby. I clearly remember my first nightmare, and recently to that day in the summer, I had a dream where I was alone and home, and I heard a feminine voice calling my name right behind the bed, and under it, when I turned, I saw a figure of this woman or girl with big eyes, almost red, and big black pupils staring at me. She didn't have a mouth or do anything, just stared at me. The nights after that nightmare, every time my sister wasn't there, I heard that voice calling my name behind my bed. It wasn't just that. I thought it couldn't have been my imagination, but I heard the air of a whisper right in my ear, like someone that really whispered my name into my ear. After that first time I heard it, I kept hearing it till this night. For the rest of the night that day, I saw shadows everywhere. I don't think that it was just my imagination or a dream. When she calls me, if I fall asleep, I'll dream about weird stuff, static images, screaming, and dreams about me eating humans with lots of gore. I clearly hear it, and I can't do nothing about it. Sometimes I hear a loud crying in the apartment above mine, also a piano playing, but nobody lives there. I also heard a name, hearing those loud crying. Zoe or Zoe. It's me again, the guy of the "can somebody tell me what's going on" post. So for a while, it all ended, and the voice stopped calling me. My girlfriend left some weeks ago, and that made me feel really weak and empty. From that moment on, the voice started again, but way worse. As I told you last post, I used to dream gore and having nightmares about me eating people alive. Those dreams are not my only dreams. I can see them in my mind sometimes. I started having episodes where every time I talk to somebody, I get really strong nausea to the point where I almost puke. I started having dreams of me mutilating people, or images in my mind of a weird dead body or heads in a state of decomposition and vomit. Also started dreaming about a lot of vomit. The voice don't always call my name, not when I'm alone. Even when my sister's in the room, and during the day when I'm home alone in the house. It started touching me, which really scared me, and I started seeing really weird hallucinations when she calls me. Only last night I saw a weird figure going under the bed on my sister. The worst thing is that it wasn't a fast thing. It went slowly, and it was a lot more real, even though I knew it wasn't. I saw my sister being awake and staring at me with wide-opened eyes. She heard noises of someone puking under the bed of my sister. In the meanwhile, the voice started calling me quite loud, and I was scared to the point that I couldn't move. I could have, but I was way too scared to do anything but look at my phone, afraid of crossing my eyes with whatever was under my sister's bed, or my sister. I started having a really strong anxiety and nervousness, and I can get even with the small things. Since it started recalling me, I have weird thoughts. I don't think I can even tell here. I really hope it's my imagination, though. On her last few days of consciousness, my maternal grandmother began to experience hallucinations. Initially, she mistook her own son for her deceased brother who had been dead for over 6 decades. Although there was some resemblance between the two, it's still slightly difficult to comprehend. To everyone's surprise, she started scolding him and reprimanding him for all of his wrongdoings in life, despite the fact that he had already passed away after living a life plagued with alcoholism, leaving behind his wife and children destitute. This was a distressing situation for everyone, particularly for her late brother's ghost. As her condition deteriorated, her brain continued to play tricks on her, and she began seeing imaginary things. She even requested for someone to remove a buffalo she claimed to be seeing on the ceiling. We tried our best to comfort her and told her to rest, but it was difficult to know what to do in these situations. We certainly didn't want to scold the buffalo, as she had scolded her late brother's ghost. 12 hours later, my grandmother saw my paternal grandmother entering the room. This was particularly strange because my paternal grandmother had passed away 3 years prior, and they were different religious faiths and had not been particularly close to my maternal grandmother. In fact, neither of them had been particularly thrilled with my parents' marriage. At their wedding rehearsal, my paternal grandmother had famously introduced herself to my paternal grandmother with the words, "I'm sorry my son got your daughter pregnant. I swear I raised him better than that." Despite their differences, they had still spent many holidays and events together as they both shared grandchildren in common. They were both extremely dedicated hostesses who spent decades outdoing each other in politeness. Therefore, my maternal grandmother looked up and said, "Wait, when did your paternal grandmother get here?" We knew that it was probably a polite invitation from heaven. Alternatively, it could have been heaven needed to find someone who my grandmother wouldn't yell at. The hallucinations continued until her final moments, but we were comforted by the thought that she had been reunited with her loved ones who had passed. Help with growing up in a creepy house. When I, a 29-year-old male, was growing up in the UK, we lived in a normal, terraced house. This comes into the story later. It's a long story, so sorry for that. So, we had a 2-bedroom house, and I hated my bedroom. I always felt uneasy and scared there. Especially scared of the built-in wardrobe. The door would always open. And even when I made sure it was closed, the wardrobe had my mom's things in it. Plus, I would hear footsteps on the landing of the stairs, and it was a very distinctive noise. It wasn't normal creaking, and my mom would say, "Don't worry," and it's just the next door neighbors. The floorboards are all connected. Me being young and dumb believed that. It never got any worse than that for years, just footsteps moving around, and the door, and the constant fear, and I couldn't shake it. Then my sister was born, and we needed a 3rd bedroom, so my parents turned the attic into a 3rd bedroom, which became mine. But whilst they were renovating, the stairs going up to the attic needed to be built. And it went to the other side of the creepy wardrobe, and the partition wall was left open and covered with a plastic sheet, and I was playing in the hallway with my 2 friends next to it, and then got a sudden fear, and it descended worse than ever, and the sheet of plastic shot out, like a figure had run into it. We all ran screaming, and my mom came to check and said, "What happened?" I'll never forget how her face dropped, and she went white. She just said, "Don't worry. The workmen must be putting in the new windows in your room." And it made a draft. Fast forward to the attic becoming my bedroom. I was even more terrified than in my old room. The noises of footsteps coming up my stairs, the constant fear. I thought I saw a figure a few times out of the corner of my eye. Never had on, and could never sleep. It got so bad I had to sleep on the floor of my sister's room for about 2 years. Now this is the kicker. My mom is very spiritual, and what was in the wardrobe I hated. A Ouija board. She had a horrible experience with it once, and she said that she can't get rid of it. Is that true? I am a believer. More creepy going-ons have happened to me throughout the years. This was the worst and most consistent, though. We lived in the house from when I was 4 to 12, and once we moved, nothing creepy happened in the new house, or any of the other houses ever again. I still feel that weird feeling in places, but never more than that. So I was 16. I questioned my mom on it all, and she felt it all too. She heard and saw things more than me, but didn't want me or my sister to be scared. She still wouldn't say what the board said or did, but it was when she was young when it happened. Was wondering if any of you guys would know what was happening here. My mom is very hesitant to talk. I don't know what's going on, but I need help. For about a month or so, every night at exactly 3 a.m., I wake up out of a dead sleep with no explanation. When this first started happening, I was sleeping in the middle of the night, and I heard someone in my ear, and it sounded so real I was scared. but it whispered in my ear, "Hey, your front door is open." And I immediately woke up and walked up the stairs to come to the front door to check it out, and it was wide open. The really scary part for me is last night. I was downstairs in my bedroom taking off my makeup. My boyfriend had gone upstairs to get a glass of water. My bedroom is right next to the second living room we have downstairs. I heard my boyfriend's voice coming from the living room saying, "Hey babe," in a very cheerful voice. I said, "Yeah," in response. Then he proceeded to ask me how I was, which confused me because he had just left the room. But I replied that I was good and asked him how he was. No response. I called his name a few times and asked if he was there, but no answer. I stayed in my chair and didn't move for about a minute later. After sitting in silence, he came through the bedroom door. I asked him what he had been doing, and he said I was getting a glass of water. And I asked if he was trying to mess with me, and he said no, that he was just upstairs. I said, "So I just was talking to you from the living room." And he said no, so I explained everything that happened, and he swears it wasn't him, and now believes I'm crazy, but I know what I heard. My interaction with La Lechuza. So my wife and I moved out to a ranch to work on each other as we were having some difficulties at the time. The place we moved into originally had a group of farmers living in it. Lots of random junk laid about the property. After living there for about 2 weeks, I decided to clean up the property a bit. Maybe make it look a bit nicer. I made a fire pit to dispose of all the leftover garbage and whatnot when I stumbled across a white beheaded owl. I felt spiritually that it would be more respectful to burn the owl's body than bury it because there were some stray dogs that visited the property. That same night, our lights began flickering every night. My wife would hear footsteps outside the house while I'd be at work, but she would see no one. Then the woman appeared. She'd stand off in the darkness and sway back and forth slowly, as if she was dancing. She wore a white dress and had long black hair that covered any facial features. She'd be there every night. When I'd get back to the car, my lights would actually shine on her. So one day, I go to where she stood, but during the day, to see if maybe it was an object, and there was nothing. The area was a field of dead grass. No objects of any kind on the ground. There was a burn spot where she would stand. After more time passed, one of the strays attacked my dogs, and the landlord stated our animals were the problem. We got fed up with the bullshit and left. Later I heard that the dog who attacked me mysteriously died and the property was flooded, causing full power failure to the environment. I believe burning the corpse of the owl released the witch. Paranormal events are happening to me more and more, and I don't know why. Help. Ever since I was a little kid, I've had extremely strange and terrifying nightmares. I used to lay awake and see things in my doorway. I remember several times running to my mom's room crying after a nightmare, getting in her bed and asking her if there's a man or a woman standing in the closet or the doorway. We moved to a new house and they stopped. But I then started a shared experience with my family. 2 stand out. Once we were all going to sleep when we heard a huge bang from the attic. Even my skeptical stepdad was spooked. We lived there for 10 years and never heard it again. It sounded like something very heavy fell. Another time, my mother would have a garland for Christmas ornaments outside my room and on an archway. It had oversized ornaments on it. I would constantly see a little girl in the ornaments standing just outside my door. I once asked my cousin if she could see it, and she said yes. We even took turns standing where it would be, and nothing was there to cause the reflection. When we bought that house, we took the old wallpaper off my room in the basement and found murals of the devil dancing and drinking with nude women. I know that sounds like bullshit, but this is all true. We painted over it. Now, I've moved to another house that is more new than the others were. The first house was built in the 70s, and the second was 1899, the current 2018. So, just about an hour around 3:30 a.m., I was about to fall asleep, like right on the edge of losing consciousness, when I started hearing this weird clicking and tapping sound. At that point, I was still trying to wake up and make sense of what was happening. Next, I heard my door open just a bit. The carpet is thick, so it has to be pushed pretty hard and it's audible. I look and the door I know, I closed, and it's open about 2 inches. It closes with a click. Only way to open it is to twist the knob. And I know with 100% certainty that I closed it all the way. I woke up shaking, and now I'm terrified to go to sleep. Other things that have happened to me in this house, though. 1. A friend and I were drinking, and we heard a loud sound like pebbles being thrown at the wall. I looked, and several pieces of my dog's food were all over the floor. No way it could have gotten there logically. My dog was sleeping, and we were alone. My dog's food is kept in a closed storage container. 2. There are 2 large cracked framed pictures sitting against the wall by the unused side of my bed. Last weekend I stayed at a friend's house. Came back to one completely caved in, broken glass all over the floor. The only thing that could have caused this is me throwing a pillow over there, and I would have noticed when I picked it up. One last thing I can recall right now is one night I got home from work, went to bed, and saw a dark mass against my wall. I am a naturally paranoid person, very aware of my surroundings, and I knew the second I saw it, it wasn't just some shadow or trick my eyes were doing. It was vaguely in the shape of a tall person. I told myself that it was just a shadow from the light coming through the window or something. But the next night, at the same time, it was gone. I haven't seen it since. My friend is Navajo and thinks that I need cleansing ritual done. Wants me to go to the res, where some of his family stays. It's like I have something following me, or attached to me, and I hate it. I always feel like I'm being watched when I'm alone. A gentle haunting, school campus. In the early 2000s, I was an outside sales rep, and my best customer was a charter school, built in 1891 as a school for Indians and colored people. It operated for more than 100 years, educating thousands of children from larger cities across the nation, focusing on farming and industrial trades. On its nearly 300 acres were 6 buildings, including 2 dormitories and an old frame church. I ended up spending multiple hours on campus every week performing various functions and tasks. I loved the school and staff so much I enrolled my daughter in their first pre-K class. Very early on, the business manager and I became friends, and he told me what he knew of the history of the site and the industrial school itself. He had been a lifelong resident of the town that the school was in and knew very much about it. He also told me of the ghost. Their ghost had appeared to nearly every member of the school staff, typically seen walking through the grounds in the early morning and evening hours at the time the entity was simply described as looking like an elderly man, dressed in 20th century work-type clothing. My first experience happened on the day the dedication ceremony was held prior to the charter school officially opening. Said ceremony was attended by numerous state and local officials. A dais has been erected in front of the chapel, with power from the sound system provided via a long and thick power cable. As the chapel has no electricity to run it, the power cable had to be run from the dormitory turned classroom building about 100 feet away. At the end of the cable was a monstrous black plug. Think a 220 dryer or oven plug on steroids. This was plugged into a temporary power board erected behind the chapel. From there came the various extension cords that ran in the front of the chapel itself. As the ceremony began, I was standing with the business manager to the side and well behind the dais. We were a few feet further back than the rear of the chapel. From there, we could see the attendees and turn our heads to see the power board. The power board was roughly 12 feet behind the middle of the chapel. The extension cords run through the building directly through the dais, so as to be out of the way. At one point was a loud pop, as one would hear when a speaker is unplugged while turned on. The microphone went out, and the person speaking could be barely heard. We both looked over to see the plug itself was out of the power board and the ground. I turned to face him, and he started to tell me that he had to plug it back in, but while he went up to let the folks know what was going on, he didn't get to finish, as in 2 to 3 seconds, the power to the microphone was restored. We looked in each other's eyes in a rather what the fuck moment, then turned to see the plug into the power board. There was no one within 50 feet of it. We were the only 2 people behind the building, and the outlet for the plug was about 3.5 feet off the ground. When I looked back at the business manager, he simply said, "There's our ghost." The second incident was the first time I've ever seen a ghost or an entity in general. My company was installing the network cables for classrooms in the main building. The design of the building was pretty straightforward: a central section with a main office, nurse, cafeteria, and gym, with 2 hallways running perpendicular to that, one on each side. The day we started was the day that all the doors in the locked building had been changed. I was helping the techs that day, as we were a small company and didn't have proper IT staff. I was friends with the school secretary, and she made me promise I wouldn't lose the key she was giving to me, as it was not only the master key, it was the only key they had for the new locks, as the locksmith hadn't dropped the rest of the keys off yet. We went to the basement to gain access to the crawl spaces that ran under each classroom hallway. The secretary showed us the basement door, gave me the key, then locked the door behind us as to prevent any students from coming down into the basement. Each crawl space was roughly 100 feet long, with a single bare light bulb hung at the far end. The entry to the crawl space was about 4 feet off the floor, and the crawl space slowly tapered at a ceiling height of about 5 feet to about 3 feet at the far end. It was maybe 4 feet wide, but it was tight. The tech and I had been running cable for a couple of hours and were down in the crawl space furthest from the stairs leading down from the main level, which we could see was at the bottom, and from where we were just about halfway down, and I was to the left of my tech, with him between me and the basement. At one point, I caught movement out of the peripheral, and I looked past him into the basement. What I saw was an older-looking white man, maybe early 60s, salt and pepper hair, wearing what I would have said were medium brown khakis and a dark green or blue work coat. He was back just far enough away from the crawlspace entrance to see him from the knees up. When I asked my buddy who that was, 2 things happened. First, my brain realized that I couldn't tell the exact color of the man's coat because he was transparent, and my buddy's knees buckled and he fell back into me. When he turned to look at me, his face had gone gray. I looked back and the man was gone. I maneuvered around the tech and headed up the crawlspace, keeping the bottom of the stairs in sight the entire time. In my head, I was thinking some damn kid had gotten into the basement and he was screwing around. Got to the basement, dropped down to the floor to find the basement empty. The door at the top of the stairs, there were 2 flights of stairs, as the ceiling was about 15 feet high, and they turned halfway down or so at the bottom of the stairs. And directly across from the hole was a crawl space, and it was still locked. I opened the door to find the head custodian and the principal chatting in the hall. I asked if they had seen a student just come up, but they told me no. In fact, the custodian said he'd been cleaning up after a kid had vomited in the hall, and no one has been in or out of the basement in 30 minutes or so since he'd been there. I walked to the main office and asked my secretary friend who else had a key to the basement door. She told me again that there was just the one key in the entire building and I had it. She then grinned broadly and asked, "Why?" I detailed what I'd just seen, to which she said, "You've seen him, that's our ghost. Apparently he takes an interest in any changes that are being made to the building and just shows up to watch." In the midst of this, the techs come bursting through the basement door, his gear bag over his shoulder, hauling ass to the main entrance. He looks ill. I head out after him, calling his name as he raced across the campus to the parking lot. He's in his truck and gone without even acknowledging me. He told the police he drove straight home, then called out the next day. I worked closely with him for several more years. The one time I asked him what happened to him, what did he see in the basement? He looked me dead in the eye and said, "I'm not talking about it, ever. So don't ask and don't involve me if you talk about it." He was a really nice guy, very affable, and like I said, we worked together for years. It was the only time I remember seeing him when he didn't have a smile on his face. I never experienced anything else, but over the years, anyone I've run into who spent a good deal of time at that school has experienced something. Teachers, staff, parents, coaches, all the like. Having said that, I've never heard of any students experiencing anything. The ghost really didn't want me up playing games. First off, for context, upon moving in, we had weird things happen to various family members. Throughout our year living in this less than a decade-old subdivision home, weirdly enough, this isn't the only house or experience that mine or family members had. It's always made me wonder if something or multiple somethings have attached onto us. I have this really old family album that has tin photos, so late 1800s, early 1900s, and from my understanding, sometimes those photos were dead. So it's always made me question that if someone was attached to it, or I just have really made luck-renting places. Anyways, on to the story. This had to be almost 8 years ago. It was like January because it was snowing, and we had a school cancellation. So I, a 16-year-old female at the time, had been up at midnight playing the new Xbox One we had just gotten for Christmas in the living room. I had a pair of a headset on and had one ear playing sound, and the other one had nothing. While I was playing, I thought I heard a thud coming from a near spot in the front. I shook it off to my 11-year-old brother moving around in his room playing his game, and since I've always had bad hearing, I must have mistook the direction of the sound. I go back to playing, and less than an hour later, I hear what I thought was the front door go thud again. By this point, I'm freaking out. My true crime loving ass went and did the most reasonable thing and went and grabbed a knife. I peer out the peephole in the door and see nothing. And no one expect the streetlights and the orange midnight sky. At this point, my sister, a 14-year-old female, whose bedroom is above the front door, comes down to see what's going on. We're all night owls. I tell her what I heard, and she looks out the peephole too. We're talking about it, and all of a sudden the loudest bang hits the front door, scaring the piss out of me. We run up the stairs toward the bedrooms. My sister and I are in the hallways, as we decided to look out the windows to see if we could see anything or anyone, and nothing. At this point, my heart is racing. The best for the last was about to come. As my sister and I are out of view of the window, so we can't be seen, but we can be seen at an angle, and a rock comes flying at our window, cueing us running like none other into our parents' room. We wake them up and tell them about what's going on. My dad, grumpy but now convinced by my mother due to our sheer panic, he goes off to look. First the window, the peephole, and then he opened the door. Nothing. Worst and scariest of all is when we all went outside. There had been 5 inches of snow covering the ground. To our surprise, there were no footprints. None. No prints at the front door, walkway, driveway, sidewalk, or road, except for the ones that we made when we went outside. Not even tire marks from passing cars from earlier that evening. It would have been impossible to knock on the door, which not only I, but my sister heard clearly. Nor throw a rock outside so hard it hit our second-story window without being in the yard of the house. I used to have a journal that held prophecies. On a few nights in a row, my sister stayed in my room as we watched her ex lose consciousness, and his voice would change as someone claiming to be Yaqub, from the beliefs of the Nation of Islam. My sister and I have no religious background and had no connection to Islam. Hesitant to believe, I fact-checked him with everything I could find on the internet, and he came back at me with more. He also claimed that PJ was his son and that he was watching over, and even told us little-known details about her great-grandfather, who we had little to no information on at the time. He had died while we were still very young. Still skeptical, I still didn't believe what PJ had been possessed, and had an idea. I pulled out a notebook that I'd recently gotten and started asking PJ or Yaqub questions. I can't remember all the details, but he mentioned some interesting things in history that my sister and I had little knowledge of. But I also prophesied a World War III and many other things that I can no longer remember. Days passed after, and I left that notebook in a drawer in my desk, and I eventually forgot about it. Not a year later, I was sharing this story in detail with my friends, noticing how unusually foggy my memory was on the subject, but remembered the notebook itself. In an attempt to remember and prove to my friends, I searched the notebook to find that it was gone. I know I didn't touch it, my sister didn't touch it, and to this very day, I don't know where it is, but wish I took a picture. Seen a ghost of a bride right as I woke up from a vivid dream. Anyways, she was in all white, in front of the door in broad daylight. 10 a.m., I woke up late. I had my head under my pillow while I was sleeping on my stomach. I kind of felt something was behind me. So I took it off and looked back, while still on my stomach. Then I saw her. She had a white gown, holding flowers with, unfortunately, an unforgivable rotten face. Her soul seemed lovable, though. Mind you, I didn't dream about a bride, nor do I have any past connections or any past brides. Anyways, I have a high desire to be loved and to love. And plus my spirituality is getting harder to practice while going through this TI abuse. Warning, for people with an open mind to spiritual abuse. All the while going through this artificial or normal telepathic abuse, leaving me hanging dry in the dating world, so my focus on love throughout that bullshit might attract lovable souls or spirits. I have a few interpretations on what it could have been, but is this a known thing? After going through this telepathic targeted individual program, I've learned about a lot of people and the world around me. The invaders astral project into my dreams and manipulate, as well as just being horrible people that just most invaders are. My spirits, I know I didn't deserve this, as most captives of this abuse don't deserve it. They find vulnerable people, so they showed me things that ended up showing up in real life, so I know there's a huge meaning to life after death. Just, some abuse the fact that all the whole are not condoning their consequences for their afterlife, all to have fun and to project their insecurities to people. Creature in the room. Something talked through my child. December 3rd, 2022. It was around 10 p.m. My daughter was asleep on the sofa. I took her up to bed. She was a sleepwalker, and she said, "Stop it, Dad." I said, "I haven't done anything, Kelly." I laughed. She stopped in her tracks, and then had this odd bent forward posture with her arms stretched out down to her sides, her fingers spread out, and said, "I'm not Kelly," but in an odd old woman's voice with a deliberate pause before she said her name. "Of course you're Kelly, silly," I replied and laughed. She then carried on, walking half asleep to her bedroom. She got into bed and closed her eyes, and I kissed her on her head, and I said, "I love you, Kelly." She started to fidget in her bed, and with her eyes still closed, announced. I said, "I am not Kelly." The same old woman's voice and pause before her name, and also now a bit of irritation in her voice. Then I realized this wasn't my daughter mimicking someone, this was someone else. Then I got goose pimples all down my arms and said this with a stutter in my voice. "If you're not Kelly, then who are you then?" My daughter then opened her eyes, lifted her head, and adjusted herself to the eye-to-eye with me, and started to stare intensely into mine with these matte black eyes with no color. Then put herself back on the pillow and shut her eyes and went back to sleep. I then woke her up, and it was like I had awoken her from a deep, deep slumber. I said, "Kelly, are you okay?" She says, "Yes, Dad. Why did you wake me?" I said, "Oh, nothing, just checking on you, okay?" And then asked her to pray with me, which she did with no issue, maybe a little bit of confusion, then kissed her on the head and said, "I loved you," and left her to slumber. The next day I had to drop a parcel off at my neighbor's, and the brother and sister opened the door. I gave them their parcel. There I asked how they were because the mother had died in the summer, and I said, "Do you feel like your mom is about it all?" The daughter replied, "Oh yes, they feel her presence a lot, and they also had seen a ghost out in the fields in front of our house of a young 6-year-old who had died there playing in that area and used to be there." She then told me that she and her mother used to regularly use a Ouija board to contact the little girl, and had done this many times, speaking to her, and the little girl had replied saying she had protected the area so other children didn't get killed there. And also a friend of the family who died and was still visiting them in a spirit form, dressed in a hood, and was seen moving through the rooms at night to check on them. I don't mess with the Ouija board, it's a bad thing. And then said my goodbyes to them. I left a sick feeling in my stomach. 2 days later, I was going to bed at an early shift at work. I went to bed at 11 p.m. and went straight to sleep. But suddenly I woke. But I had my eyes shut. In my head, I heard myself say, "There's someone in the room." I opened my eyes, and in the dark I could see a man with white hair and black glasses working on a device, pressing it into somewhere in my wife's side of the bed. Jumped back shocked, I started to get out of bed and turned my head away, and I looked and he was gone. It was a real person, totally solid, and a real look to it. I wasn't scared, I was just bewildered. I went back to sleep, and somehow, then again, it happens. I'm suddenly awake with my eyes closed, and again, my mind is telling me someone is in the room. Open my eyes, and this time it's more sinister. To my right, at the side of the bed where my wife sleeps, there's a creature with matte black eyes staring at me. The eyes reminded me how my daughters looked days before. It was only 4.5 feet tall and seemed like a mixture of a gargoyle and a gremlin, with no wings and long pointed ears that pointed straight up. Nostrils like a gorilla's. Its skin was dark green and leathery, with light orangey brown strips going down its arms. It was looking straight at me with a mouth that seemed to be frothing on one side and looked very old and exhausted and very hungry and was slowly panting while looking in my direction. Slowly got out of bed, not taking my eyes off it, and slowly walked around the bed and noticed it had very long arms with 5 clawed fingers on each hand. I had the same bent forward posture my daughter had earlier the week, the arms hanging down at its sides. Also, I noticed when I was moving from the bed, its gaze did not follow me. It seemed to just be looking to where I had been sleeping. And as I got closer, maybe 5 feet away, it disappeared from the room. Well, I was scared then, but I eventually went back to sleep. The next 2 weeks were fine, but from December 2020 into February 23, I'm starting to have real trouble sleeping. I feel like I'm being watched, but also feel like an icy cold wind blows on my neck and around my spine and knees. But my wife and the rest of the family are just fine. Just me. I get really cold in areas of my body around my neck, knees, and face, especially between my eyes and nose. If I'm lucky, I'll have 1 to 2 days good sleep, and then a couple of days of bad sleep, maybe 2 hours of sleep each day. I've seen a doctor and had urine and blood tests. They all came back fine. I've been giving sleeping tablets, and I've been taking calming tablets, and they do help. But it's still happening. I'm getting cold and sometimes feel like something's there. I also saw a vicar, myself blessed, and also a crucifix in the Holy Bible blessed as well, and went around the house saying the Lord's Prayer. and then telling it to leave by the power of God and Jesus Christ. They did help for one day. The house got very positive and light, and I slept really well, but the next day I had terrible sleep again. I don't know what to do. It's very disturbing for me, but to other people, it just seems like a bad horror film. But it feels real to me. And there have been other small things starting to happen, which my other family members have noticed. Welcome to Paranormal M, the channel where we explore the world of the paranormal and supernatural. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay up to date with our latest bone-chilling stories. We hope you enjoy your stay. Christmas '88. I was 9. It was Christmas Eve, 1988. And my family's Christmas Eve party was winding down. My grandma was digging through the remnants of boxes, bows, and wrapping papers from our family's white elephant gift exchange to see what she could salvage for next year, and my mother and aunt were laughing and trading stories of holidays past. My 2 older half-sisters, Sherry and Penny, who were adults at the time, being 18 and 20 years older than me, were picking over the leftovers on the dining room table. I was sitting near the back of the Christmas tree, where 3 gifts with my name on them remained. These were from my mom and grandma. And it was a tradition that I could only open up 1 gift before bedtime on Christmas Eve. The rest I had to wait and open with my Santa gifts on Christmas morning. I assessed the 3 packages for some time before making my selection. It was nearing midnight. I had to be in bed soon, so I decided to just pick the biggest because it had weight and didn't sound like clothes when I shook it. When my mom said it was time, I eagerly unwrapped the gift. At my grandma's unspoken request, I was careful not to rip the paper or to mess up the bow, and set them aside as my gift was revealed. It was a telescope. It wasn't a high-quality count the rings of Saturn type, though. It was small, mostly made of plastic, and still had the $14.99 price sticker on the box. I was gracious, though. I wasn't impressed. Though, not because of the quality. I didn't know the difference between a nice telescope and a cheap toy one, because I simply had no interest in its function, and even if I was interested in what it did, the simple assembly required to make it work exceeded the grasp of my exceptionally short attention span. Now, my sister Sherry is the oldest, and to me back then, she was like a bossy hall monitor. She had no real authority, but that didn't stop her from trying to run everything. I'm 41 now, and she's 61, and seriously, not much has changed in that aspect. My other sister Penny is just 2 years younger than Sherry, so she would have been 29 at that time. She was different. A combination of unattended schizophrenia and drug abuse made her a wild card, meaning you never knew what you were going to get with her. On this night, she had managed to maintain a level of normalcy and a jovial mood. Though, under any circumstance at that time, and regardless of her behavior, her personality seemed more comparable to mine rather than that of any other adult in the room. Penny took an enthusiastic interest in my new gift, and asked if we could go out back and test it out. I agreed, knowing that my compliance would afford me a bit more time before I had to go to bed, and being a child on the night before Christmas, I was naturally restless. Penny and I ascended into the back porch, and in no time at all, my sister had the telescope assembled and in position for celestial exploration. It took her a bit longer to find a point of focus and adjust all the little knobs for optimal viewing, so while she was occupied with that, my attention was drawn to the icicles that formed on the awning, and the dog's water bowl that had turned to solid ice. Being a Texan, this isn't generally common even for December, though it isn't generally uncommon either. Our winters are short, and much like my eccentric sister, you never know what you're going to get when it arrives. I feel the need to preface this next part of my story with two very important points. First, I need to say that my memory of this incident, however perplexing as it is, cleared. It's vivid to me now that the very night it occurred, so this is a true and accurate account. Secondly, this entire event lasted no more than a minute, and while I must describe these events in succession, many of them occurred all at once. I had just taken off my mittens so I can utilize the full function of my hands and fingers for grasping when I heard Penny explain in amusement, "Whoa, cool." Still having no interest at all in stargazing, and far more focused on trying to retrieve the perfect icicle from the awning using a garden hoe, I didn't even look up from what I was doing, figuring she had it managed to find something bright to look at, and that just meant I had a bit more time to spend on trying to dislodge the big beautiful icicle before it melted. Then it occurred to me that the icicle was definitely melting, and quite rapidly, when just moments before, it was still in the process of forming. Now it's dripping like a leaky faucet, and what was even stranger was that all this water was dripping around me, yet it made no sound. In fact, nothing made a sound. Not the water, or the wind, or the highway in the distance. Not even my sister tinkering with that telescope. Then the dripping slowed, and I don't mean that in the sense that there was more time between each drop, but rather the droplets were taking longer to fall to the ground. Confused, I immediately looked over at my sister and found her standing upright, not bent over, peering into the telescope, but staring out into the yard. I turned to match her gaze, and what I saw completely eluded the grasp of my 9-year-old comprehension. Hovering a mere 4 feet above my backyard fence was an almost almond-shaped capsule, about the size of a pontoon boat. It was a metallic color like chrome, with no discernible crevasses, no windows, no doors. It was completely flush, and even though it had no fixtures for light or to shine from, the area around it was completely illuminated as light reflected off millions of water droplets now suspended in midair. I was struck with fear and confusion as I broke my gaze just long enough to look over at my sister, searching for some sort of sign as to what this thing was and if we were in any danger. Penny looked over at me, grinning from ear to ear. "Cindy Boo, it's a UFO." I didn't hear her say it, and her lips didn't move, but that's what she said. We both looked back at the object and tilted slightly downward. At this angle, it appeared to be spinning as a flash of iridescent lights made one complete rotation around its exterior, then in a split second shot straight up and disappeared into the night sky. Darkness resumed along with all the sounds of the night and the crisp chill of the air. I stood dumbfounded, amazed, and terrified by what I'd just experienced, while at the same time, I felt relief that it was over, and excited. I didn't know whether to run away or cry or laugh. I looked over at my sister, wanting to run to her, but still frozen to the place I stood, as if all my cognitive resources were occupied, trying to process everything, and I was monumentally unable to communicate movement to my legs. Penny was clearly not frightened by what we had just witnessed. She seemed just as blissful as I'd ever seen her, and while at times I found that refreshing, in this instance, it confused me. I needed to observe a regular adult response. Claiming the use of my legs, I ran toward the door saying, "Let's go, Mom." "Yeah," Penny agreed and followed me through the back door. I was glad she was there and had my back. I knew there was no way my mom would believe me about a spaceship if it had been only me, running in with my Kmart telescope. We entered the dining room where Mom stood laughing as my grandma sang the phrase, "We won't go until we get some." I exclaimed, "Mom, me and Penny just saw..." Briefly, I forgot what my sister had called it, but she chimed in to assist. "A UFO!" Penny injected. "You did? With your new telescope?" Mom inquired, No, it was in the backyard by my fort, right above the fence, and I wanted to tell her everything all at once, but I just wasn't fast or articulate enough to express what had all transpired. And my mom was a regular adult who saw me as an imaginative child, and my sister, well, as well, I guess, as a somewhat mild version of a crazy person she expected to show by the end of the night. Maybe it was Santa. I hope he doesn't pass you up because you're not in bed. I didn't believe in Santa Claus, and I never did. I just pretended for as long as I could for the extra presents. I did understand the situation I was in, though. I knew Mom was done for the night, and I wanted to go to bed, so they could set up the Santa gifts and finally get some rest themselves. Not to mention, she was usually well within the bounds of good insight by steering away from conversations featuring supernatural events with my sister. It just so happened that on this occasion, it was all true, and I understood that she would never know that. Shortly after that movie came out called Fire in the Sky, starring D.B. Sweeney, based on true events about a small-town man who was allegedly abducted by aliens, experimented on, and returned. The movie, coupled with my memory of that event, terrified me beyond expression, causing me to have night terrors throughout my childhood about the visitors returning to claim me. And I'm certain it initiated my lifelong battle with sleep paralysis dreams. I was so terrified I wouldn't watch or read anything that had anything to do with extraterrestrials, and I wouldn't speak of it again for nearly 30 years. Somewhere in that span of time, I convinced myself that the entire event had been a terrible nightmare that had happened. Just to remember every single detail, down to the mittens I was wearing, where they landed on the ground, when I took them off, and the rush of heat I felt, hot on my cheeks from the fireplace when I ran back into the house that night. My sister was estranged for many years throughout my childhood, as her condition got worse before it began to get better. She finally got clean and onto the right meds, and a few years ago she came to live with us. The first week she was here, she spent a lot of time talking about different things that happened over the years. Things she'd seen and things she'd done. I discovered that she barely had any recollection of any great deal of it, claiming that must have been the other me. I guess I got caught up in the spirit of sharing, or I got brave or something. But I decided to ask her about that night during one of our talks. Do you remember that one Christmas Eve? Is all I got out of my mouth before we responded with, "You mean the night we saw the UFO in the backyard?" That's a memory that stuck. I remember it as clear as yesterday. She proceeded to describe the experience from a perspective with a little variation from my own experience. So there it is. It was not a dream. It was not a 9-year-old imagination. All those little details that made no sense, the ones I used to tell myself if they didn't happen, are the same details that later on affirm the reality of it. I saw a UFO in my backyard on Christmas Eve in 1988. I was 9 years old. The sleepover gone wrong. Okay, it was my sister's birthday, and me and all my friends were planning a huge slumber party. Turns out only one of them got to stay. Well, 2 including him and his little brother. But anyways, we had a good time. Skateboarded, basketball, and video games. But when night came, they were trying to go to sleep. I couldn't sleep at all. I heard something slapping my window. It was no tree. I'm on the 2nd floor of my house, and there were no trees nearby other than in our backyard, but nowhere close to my window. We heard bumping. I remember my friend just staring out the window, shocked, so we decided to sleep somewhere else. We woke up his little brother, we got up and went to our bonus room, and we heard walking in my sister's room, and no one was in there. They were sleeping somewhere else. We were so scared we went to our other sister's room. We thought it was safe there, but bad idea. I realized my sister would realize her younger brother and his friends were hiding in the room of her bedroom. I'm the middle, oldest child, So we just went out of there. Then we resorted to go back into my room. My friend felt like he was being watched. He kept staring at the ceiling. We decided it was best to go to sleep. Next morning, we went on with our day as casually as we could. And back at school, we told our friends. They wouldn't buy it. They said it was probably a tree, when there wasn't a tree by my window. It was annoying. So now my friends only come here to investigate why my house is so creepy, because there's so many scary things that happen here. I know this is really scary because there are so many things that it could have been. But imagine having to get up at 1:30 a.m. because your window is getting knocked on so much. Back like 2 years ago, when I moved here, I'd went to a graveyard that was set like 2 blocks away from my house with a friend. We were kind of just walking around and looking at the graves. And this happens also to be a graveyard that a family friend was buried in. We were sort of messing with each other a little and were like, "Whoa, did you hear that?" But obviously implying it's a joke. And another one until we actually freaked out because we had both heard a third pair of footsteps walking behind us. We both turned around at the same time and looked at each other, hoping the other didn't think they were crazy. We laughed it off, saying it was just an echo, which didn't even make sense, but we went with it. Later, when we were leaving to go back to my house, we were walking on the trail, and I had seen a man standing over an old white grave. He looked genuinely depressed. I looked over to my friend and said, "Aw, that's so sweet and kind of sad." And then she looked back at me incredibly confused, asking what I was talking about. I pointed over to the man, and she looked over and told me she didn't see anyone. I thought she was fucking with me until I realized she was actually genuinely concerned. And when I was still looking around, and the man looked up at me, right at me, and we passed a tree that blocked my vision for a second. But when I could see the grave again, he was gone. It felt like something out of a horror movie. We talked about it for a bit after that, but it never came up again after a couple days. Since then, a few weird things have been happening at my house that I just can't explain. They weren't really little things either. Since this is already a lot of reading, I'll just say a few that bothered me the most. There was the one time my sister and I had gotten locked in one of the downstairs rooms for 3 hours with no one to let us out. However, the door didn't even have a lock. Maybe the doorknob just got stuck or something, but the way it was just didn't make any sense. Anyways, my sister and I were having a casual conversation and walked into the room. And by instinct, I had closed the door to keep the cat out, because we didn't let the cats into the room to stop them from peeing on things. We had kept talking for about 10 minutes, but I remembered I had to go do something, so I went to go leave, and the door wouldn't open. The knob would just turn, but the door still wouldn't open. Wouldn't even budge a little. After 20 minutes or so of pulling and tugging on the door as hard as I could, even trying kicking and ramming into it, I got the genius idea to remove the hinges so I could just get the door off. The first 2 came out super easy because the hinges had just been greased, but the last one, just like the door, wouldn't move. No matter how hard I tried to get it out, I couldn't. We ended up being stuck there for 3 hours before we got desperate and called for our dad to come help. He ended up busting the door down and breaking the door, but it was necessary. I couldn't have just been some malfunction with the doorknob system, but it felt like someone was holding the door shut. Another time, I was upstairs cleaning and listening to music. I went to the kitchen to put a few dishes from the table into the dishwasher, and I went back to the living room to change the song, but noticed a random puddle of blood dripped weirdly across the floor. I panicked and checked myself everywhere for a cut or something and found nothing. I cleaned the blood, and that was that. Nothing else happened. It was just odd. There was this other time when the same friend I went to the graveyard with was spending the night, and she had just come upstairs, pale, white, and freaked out, trying to tell me something. She told me she just saw a white figure staring at her while she was changing, and that it couldn't have been her or clothes. It had a face, and it was pure white. She left shortly after that. Couldn't really blame her, to be honest. When I was growing up, my older brother had an insatiable fascination with ghosts and the paranormal. He would constantly read books and watch shows about these topics, and he would often try to scare me by telling me ghost stories or making spooky noises in the dark. However, his obsession with the supernatural reached a new level when he purchased a doll from a website that claimed to contain trapped souls. According to my brother, the doll he bought had a young girl's soul trapped inside of it. He would show it to me, and just looking at the creepy, lifeless eyes of the doll was enough to send shivers down my spine. But my brother didn't stop there. He would often chase me around the house with the doll, laughing as I screamed and cried in horror. The night when I was in middle school, I was doing homework at my desk in my room. Suddenly I felt a sharp pinch on my leg, and when I looked down, I saw a small, visible bruise in the exact spot where I'd felt the pinch. I was confused and scared, but I tried to shrug it off and continue with my work. Later that night, my brother and I were watching TV in the living room. I hadn't told him about the strange incident with the pinch and the bruise, but out of nowhere, he told me that he had felt a pinch on his leg while he was playing video games in his room. He laughed and said that he thought it was the doll, trying to scare me even more. My heart sank when I heard this, because I knew that something weird was going on. I told my brother about the pinch and the bruise on my leg, and he showed me that he had the same bruise in the same spot. We were both freaked out, and we slept with the lights on for weeks afterwards. Now that I'm 24 years old, I still think about that creepy doll from time to time. I suppose it's possible that the bruise and the pinch were just a coincidence, but it seemed too strange to be a bug or some other normal explanation. My brother still has the doll, but thankfully nothing paranormal has happened since that one unsettling experience. But who knows? Maybe the doll is still holding on to its ghostly secrets, waiting to reveal them to us once again. The Biltmore Hotel. When I was 17 years old, my best friend, who was 16 at the time, and I took a trip to the Biltmore Hotel in Florida after watching a Sam and Colby video about it. Of course, we couldn't find the luxurious presidential suite that they stayed in, so we settled for a room that was known to be haunted instead. We packed our belongings and began to set up for a seance. We wanted to make sure that we were respectful, so we lit candles and introduced ourselves to any entities that might be present. Then we called out to them, saying, "Hello, spirits. We come in here with full respect and come not to harm, but to investigate. If there's anyone here with us, could you give us a clear sign of your presence?" About 15 seconds later, we heard a knock on the wall opposite us. We brushed it off, thinking it might have been people staying in the next room, since we were in a well-known hotel. But when we called out again and asked if someone or something was trying to communicate with us, we heard 2 knocks from the same wall. We weren't sure if it was a coincidence, so we brought out a piece of ghost hunting equipment called a spirit box. We connected it to a soundproof pair of headphones, and my best friend put them on. She closed her eyes, and I relaxed so that we could begin to do the Estes method, a technique that involves sensory deprivation. I began to ask questions to anything that could be present, starting with, "Is there anything here with us?" My best friend then called out, "It's me." But there was no way she could have heard my question being asked. I took a deep breath and I asked, "Who is here with us?" My best friend responded with, devil and malicious. I was spooked and tapped my friend to stop the session. But as we were about to pack up and leave, the wardrobe door to the right side of us flung open, and a white robe fell off the hanger. It was a chilling moment, and we were both left feeling unsettled. Looking back on it now, I still get goosebumps thinking about that experience. It was a reminder that the paranormal world is unpredictable and mysterious, and we should always use caution when venturing into it. Four red orbs right in front of me. This is something that happened last night. I didn't believe this was a no-sleep story, but I was hoping someone here could explain this or share their experience with me to help me feel better. But I should also give you a little context about myself. To start, I sleep on the opposite end of the bed, where normal people would put their feet, I guess you could say. I switch it up occasionally. Sometimes I sleep on the normal end, but more often than not, my head is at the end of the bed, and my feet is where the head would go, I guess. It's a nightmare sometimes when my pillows fall off the ground because it's at the foot of the bed, and there isn't a reliable headboard. I don't have a personal reason as to why I do this, but when people ask, I usually tell them it's because I don't like my cat sleeping near my head. They like to look out the window, especially when I keep it open, so it's a win-win. They get to look out the window when they want, but they're still at my feet. To be frank, I don't care if they sleep near my head. My brain just tells me this isn't normal, so I feel like I have to come up with an excuse. But I do this simply because I want to, no other reason than that. At the head of my bed are two windows, as I previously stated. When I lay down, I'm looking at these two windows, and directly behind me is my bedroom door. Now, I'm not a spiritual person. However, I do believe in the paranormal. I've had a few experiences growing up, but this takes the cake, and I'm still reeling from it. What it was, what I could be. What's the explanation? Or most importantly to me, will it happen again? Anyways, I was getting ready for bed last night. I wasn't particularly tired, as I struggled with insomnia, but sometimes, if I lay in bed long enough, I'll fall asleep. The sleep isn't restful, as I'd wake up in the morning aching all over, but that's another story. I had used the restroom, brushed my teeth, and crawled into bed. I made sure to leave the door cracked open for the cats. I have two cats, but one of mine prefers my roommate's room, and my roommate's cat prefers my room. My youngest cat sleeps on the nightstand that overlooks the window, and Hannibal, my roommate's cat, takes the bed. I reached for my lamp and turned it off. I put in some earbuds for the next half hour or so and closed my eyes. Eventually, I get bored of the music, take my headphones out to charge my phone. Wired earbuds are better than Bluetooth ones, no debate needed, and I see it. 4 red dots at the end of my bed, right in front of me. They were lined up in a square formation, 2 dots on top, 2 dots on the bottom. I, of course, freaked out, but I was also curious. I looked around my room thinking it was the reflection from somewhere. I even peeked out the window for good measure. Nothing. I looked behind me thinking I left a light on, and this was the result. But still, nothing. My roommate was out of town this weekend and didn't come back until today, so it wasn't her. Then I'm pretty sure I saw it blink. These were 4 red dots, barely over the size of a laser pointer, and they didn't just flash on then off again. It was like an eyelid slowly covering the eye, and then open. 2 things happened. 1, my flight response was triggered, but my fight response was too. It's like I wanted to desperately run, but I wanted to figure out the cause of this first. 2, the cats perked up. My youngest, who I'd never seen bare her teeth or growl before, was in a fighting stance. Hannibal was too, but he was hissing, looking back at me, then back at the red orbs, growling. When this happened, I literally shivered. A clouded sense of fear rushed over me, and I felt like I was stuck in place, like sleep paralysis, but I was able to move, and I knew that I was totally awake. The cats closed in on the red orbs. Hannibal could probably swat at them with no strain. When they blinked again, I realized this wasn't some illusion or deception. This wasn't a mirage. This was real. If the cats are reacting to it, then it's fucking real. The most uncomfortable part was the fact that the things were right at my feet, on the wall underneath the window. If this was something paranormal, they could simply drag my feet or even reach out to touch me. I'm a paranoid person by default, and when I'm home, I question every type of movement in this house out of fear of an intruder. But this was different. This was different because I had a plan. If there is an intruder, but not a demon or a ghost or an entity. Soon, a very dark presence flooded over me. I felt it in my soul, and a scream burned my throat as I tried not to react too dramatically. I eventually slowly reached for my phone, asked Siri to turn on my flashlight. She obliged, and I shined it directly toward the red dots. They were gone. It was like the cats were taken out of the trance. As right when I did this, they immediately relaxed and looked at me with confusion. I had no answers for them, or myself. My youngest ended up sleeping on my chest, and Hannibal left the room in a rush. He won't come back in. To whoever that is, or whatever that was, I hope I never experience it again. I didn't sleep last night, probably won't tonight either. But I know that from now on, I'm sleeping with the light on. My boss came to see me when he died, to make sure I finished my job. So this just happened last week. The warehouse I work at was loading an empty trailer with a pallet jack. Once I filled it up 30 pallets of merchandise, I decided to have one last look and inspect everything one last time before I closed it and get ready to send it on its way. I walked in, and I was halfway in when I saw my boss standing there. I froze in fear, and I called out to him. I'm like, "Alex, when did you come in here?" He turned around and he was pale and ignored me and walked out. This wasn't like him. Alex never ignores me. But it was like if he didn't know me. Then walked out confused and went to his office. The lights were out. I told my coworker, why was Alex inside the container I was loading? I told her it's very strange he was in there just standing, and he even ignored me. She was like, that's impossible. He left for an errand like 20 minutes ago and hasn't come back. I didn't believe her. So I went to the parking lot and his car wasn't there. Once I saw that, I felt dizzy and almost had a heart attack. I still have the image fresh in my mind of what I saw in there. I saw him, but like I mentioned, it was more like a scary version of him. He looked pale and just scary and completely ignored me, like he didn't even see me. Then afterwards, the sheriff came and told us Alex had just been in a nasty car accident and didn't make it. I'm beyond terrified to go back to work, but I have to go. I can't explain what happened. No, I don't do drugs, nothing like that. I know what I saw. I saw his ghost to make sure I finished my job. I just hope he doesn't keep appearing. After that happened, another coworker told me she was in the break room and she felt like someone was behind her, staring at her. She turned around and no one was there. Something strange after my grandpa passed away. Okay, so my grandpa passed away one day due to some internal bleeding caused by some injury he had a few days prior. When me and my family reached their place on the day he passed away, for the funeral and stuff, I was feeling really sad, but couldn't just cry it out like anyone else. I don't know, that was kind of strange because I was a kid who would easily cry, even over the smallest of things. Fast forward the same day, but at night, everyone preparing to sleep, setting up beds and stuff. It was kind of hard for me to fall asleep, but when I did, I actually saw a cloud of dust, in my dream of course, taking shape. It was forming a rough human figure, and it took some time for me to realize, but that formed my grandpa, but younger in age. I've never seen a younger photograph of him. And he told me some stuff which was kind of showing his love and affection towards me and my dad, his son, which he was never able to express. Then he said, "I'll always be watching over you," and then went on to climb up a shiny staircase which was going upwards, but too high for me to see. Is that normal, or was that just a dream? Rest in peace, Grandpa. Touched at the Denim Inn. When I was younger, my mom and I loved to travel to haunted locations in the region. One place we found ourselves at one summer was the Denim Inn in Monticello, Florida. Our room was on the second floor, second on the right. It faced out to the front yard. It was the height of summer, and the AC was not strong on the second floor. We settled in for the night. We decided to share the queen bed rather than mess up the day bed across the room as well. Due to the heat, the fan was going, and we kicked the heavy comforter off the bed right away and only slept with a thin sheet covering us. I wore only a long baggy t-shirt and underwear to go to sleep. By the next morning, my only limb fully covered by the thin sheet was my right leg. Around 6 that morning, I checked later, I felt a hesitant and gentle slide from my right ankle to my left knee. Half asleep and half awake, I simply kicked my foot. A little bit later, same touch, but now it's starting on the inside of my left wrist and moves to the inside of my left elbow. Same reaction, except now I mutter, "Stop." Little while later, same touch, except right inside elbow, down to the right inside wrist. Slightly stronger reaction, shook my arm and said louder, "Stop." Little while later, I felt the touch on the inside of my right knee. Problem, it was under the covers. At this moment, I sat up in bed loudly. "Stop touching me, just stop touching me." My mom woke up asking me what was wrong. My response, "Mama, something keeps touching me and won't leave me alone." We looked throughout the room, no mosquitoes, flies, or even loose threads on the sheets. Nothing should have or could have caused a distinct touching pattern like that. That morning at breakfast, we mentioned at the owner that we believed I was touched. Without any detail, she asked, "Was an arm or leg out of the blankets?" Yeah. "What room again?" I told her out her room name. It was by far the haunted room. She just nodded her head and responded, "That's Aunt Sarah." I had already heard about Aunt Sarah, the daughter of the original builder and last living inhabitant of the family of the house, but I wasn't in her room or her space, so she never crossed my mind. Once again, the owner said it's Aunt Sarah. She likes to tuck people in, so any time an arm or leg is exposed, she tucks it in. I've also been getting more reports out of that room lately that Aunt Sarah is more active than any other. The other rooms have been fairly quiet. We've heard a good one out of that room, though. Do you mind if I share your story? Me? No, go ahead. We still had another night to stay, but nothing happened. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well, and all my limbs stayed fully covered. I'm a Southerner by life, heart, and family. I've never woken up because of the mosquito tracing lines down my arms or legs. I sleep with fans more often than not. I've never felt that from an overhead fan before. I will forever believe something or someone touched me. I guess with good intentions. Hesitant to start questioning this, but I think there's some entity in my apartment. I live in a trendy downtown area loft, somewhere inside a 100-year-old building. It used to be a clothing factory in the late 1800s into the 1950s. This is a short story, but I recently moved in, and one morning on the left side of the kitchen sink, it was filled with coffee mugs. They were neatly placed. My girlfriend didn't have an explanation, and neither did I, although I postulated that I may have been sleepwalking, which I haven't done since I was a small child, so not likely. The mugs didn't need to be cleaned, since we just moved and all the dishes were clean. It's just weird. My girlfriend and I have talked about it since, but I honestly feel like we just want to avoid the subject. What do you think? There's a little more to this. When I was putting dishes away on move-in week, a shelf collapsed and all the glass came avalanching onto my head and shoulders. Thankfully, I was wearing a ball cap and hoodie, so I wasn't injured, but we had a big mess to clean up. The shelf appeared sturdy as I was loading it up, but I don't understand how it broke. Two more things. While sitting in my office, I heard my girlfriend say, "Psst," to get my attention. I went over to her and said it back, asking Wei what she wanted to show me. She claimed she didn't say anything. My girlfriend and I have a black cat, and I've been seeing the cat out of the corner of my eye when it's not really there. Last night, my girlfriend said she hallucinated the cat, where he was not. My black dog following me. I've been carrying, and only let out to a few very close friends, but after recent instances, I feel I need more input. This starts when I was about 9 years old, living in a house me and my family knew was haunted. Footsteps in the attic, the occasional ghostly figure turning a corner down the hall, things being misplaced and then left in the open. We lived in between an old cemetery and an old church, and it was, of course, an old house. I've lived in Texas my whole life for context, since the only similar stories I've heard are old English ones, and this ghost or omen or entity has been following me wherever I go, it seems. At 9 years old, my childhood dog passed away. He was a German Shepherd and a sweet dog. He spent a lot of time with me, laying next to me while I would read or watch TV. Well, a week or so after he passed, I was in my room and on her bed reading as I always did. My mom's room was down the tile hallway that had no windows, and we kept the doors closed until we were inside the room, so the hallway was always dark. And I heard his nails clicking on the tile, as I was very accustomed to. He'd done it 100 times before. He stopped at the end of the hallway outside the door like always, just his dark head poking out around the corner of the doorframe. He was very well behaved and always waited on invitation to enter the room. So I glanced up from the book and patted the bed next to me without thinking, out of instinct. I went back to my book. Then I realized he'd died. I looked up and nothing was there. I also realized I hadn't heard the taps of his nails walking away. Spooked, of course, I left the room. But this is where things became odd, and I didn't notice this correlation for years. One of my very good friend's fathers passed away that night in his sleep from a heart attack. Now we fast forward a few years till I'm about 12, living in Wimbley, Texas. My then best friend, who's over at my house one night hanging out, we were sitting on the back porch watching the fireflies pulsing in the woods when she tapped me, getting my attention, and she pointed, asking if I saw what she was seeing, and sure enough, I did. about 20 feet into the tree line, there was a dark dog-like figure, about the size of a husky, but all black, trotting past, looking at us. Oddly stunning to look at as we just watched it pass by. We continued to hang out, and when it was time to go, she asked if I wanted to go with her family to the water park, like I had before, and I declined. I was planning on gaming that night and the following day, when the water park trip was happening. I was woken up the next morning by my mom, informing me that my best friend had passed away that morning in a horrible car accident. That death really rocked my world, my first time losing a friend, or anyone I knew well. Fast forward 3 more years, I'm 15. My older brother was in the army, and he came home some weekends and we shared a room. I fell asleep and dreamed of the dog, walking past the foot of my bed, and sat next to my brother's empty bed. The next week, he totaled his car in a DUI accident. The police on scene said that if he was an inch taller, his roof would have scalped him, if not decapitated him. Then 3 more years later, I'm 18. My brother's out of the military, getting back on his feet and living with us. And I have a similar dream, but this time, coming out of my bathroom, and my brother was in his bed. The dog just looked and panted. 3 nights later, my brother had this second and final DUI, this time breaking his spine. He's fully recovered, the lucky idiot. But now for our most recent encounter. An old friend of mine became pregnant about a year ago. My girlfriend isn't fond of her, so we don't keep in touch anymore. I had a dream of my girlfriend and her talking on the couch. I live in Texas still. She lives outstate and has for years. And the dog was sitting on the ground next to her. I woke up panicked, but it wasn't until a month later I checked on her to find out that she'd had a miscarriage. The dog never seemed scary or threatening, always calm and warm. It was a calming presence, regardless of what came after. It never seemed to be a threat. A large bird hanging around my infant son and I. I feel weird bringing this up in general, but looking for suggestions, so here I go. I told my husband maybe it'd be best to provide more backstory, so this might be helpful. We've been trying for children since marriage in 2014, never conceived after 3 years. Sought medical intervention. Without cause, I was diagnosed with anovulation since there was no reason for us not to conceive. Just wasn't happening for us. A few more years passed by, and we decided to do a type of fertility treatment. And we were successfully pregnant. On the first try, with our first son, we'll call him D. The pregnancy was going perfectly. 6 months pregnant, I started not feeling well late at night. We went to the hospital and was in preterm labor. We had our son in a few hours and he passed shortly after he was born. Without cause, no explanation why preterm labor happened. Absolutely tragic. He was born and passed August 2021. 7 years of infertility, medical pregnancy, and a loss. I was done with family planning, or at least for a while. When I spontaneously conceived 2 months later with our second son. This is where my husband started his post yesterday. Since having our second son in July 2022 is when I first noticed this bird thing, is what I say anyway. I first saw it maybe the night I had our son or the night after. All I remember is it being very, very late, and I first noticed it. It perches in a windowsill, usually around the baby. First when he was 2 days old in the hospital, then never saw it again until a handful of times, and now I see it more frequently, as our son is now 7 months old. Just trying to understand what it is. The obvious here is, am I hallucinating? I've been mentally evaluated for PTSD. that I had been having since our first son's passing, and my therapist didn't have much to say about it other than it was odd. I've seen it with and without antidepressants. Overall, seen it 5, maybe 6 times. I respond to seeing it, and if you get a feeling someone calls out your name, and if you do a double take, and it's there, just perched, looking down and away. Or you're passing a room and you think you see something in the corner of your eye, so you double take, and yep, there it is. It's a dark blue or purple with a pink shine to it. Smallish head with a raven's beak and a long tail. I don't feel like it's harmful, but I'm also not naive. I never communicate, and I've never tried to. I'd rather not communicate with it either. But when I saw it most recently, it wasn't over our 7-month-old. It was hanging out with me in the living room, ruffling up, and it's adjusting its feet. We've been having activity in our house lately. I, a 26-year-old female, have always been fascinated by all things paranormal, but there was a time in my life where I didn't totally believe. I was open to the idea of some sort of paranormal entity existing somewhere, but in my heart, didn't really put much stock into it. Over the years, that's drastically changed. Here's one of the encounters that made me a believer. When my wife and I were newly married, we were very close with another couple who lived in our area. We would travel with them, double date with them, and we considered them our best friends. One day, they went out of town and asked us to watch their animals for them. They had a cat, a bearded dragon, a red iguana, and 2 rats. We agreed to watch them, and they left. I worked very close to their home, so I would go over to the house once in the morning, once in the afternoon, and on my lunch hour, and then again in the evening. Usually I'd be alone for the morning and afternoon visits due to my job being closest to their home, and then my wife would join me in the evening visit. One day during my afternoon visit, I purposely left the lights in their home off. They were getting enough natural light through the house to see fairly well without the lights on that day, and I wanted to save them on their electricity bill while they were gone. Again, this was a conscious choice to leave their lights off. This was something I actively thought about. I did not touch their lights after I checked on the animals. I went back to work, leaving every light switch untouched. When my wife and I arrived back that evening, I froze in the driveway. I could see from where I was standing outside that the entryway and hallway lights were both on. I told my wife, I didn't turn those lights on. I didn't even touch them. She asked me if I was sure, and I told her that I was 1,000% sure. We thought that maybe someone from their HOA had come by, or one of their family members, or that someone had noticed that they were out of town and broke in. We each put a car key between our knuckles and entered the house. The house was eerily quiet. I couldn't hear any of the animals moving around, and the air felt stale, like I could have choked on it, kind of stale. We slowly made our way through the house, checking the closets and looking for any sign of disturbance. Every light was on in every room that we entered. After we had checked every room and absolutely nothing was out of place, we both relaxed somewhat. I even started to gaslight myself into believing that I had somehow turned on every single light in every single room, even the rooms I hadn't entered. Suddenly we heard a loud thud come from the reptile room, the one we had literally just left. The thud was loud enough that the house shook. We threw the door open and nothing was disturbed. Nothing had fallen. Nothing had moved, not an inch. The only thing that had changed was the bearded dragon. The bearded dragon's enclosure was large and positioned on the floor, with a sliding glass door in the front. The dragon, who had been peacefully resting when we checked just a minute before, was now rhythmically tapping its nose against the glass in a perfect pattern. Tap, 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 over and over again. It was almost robotic. I stared in disbelief. I'd never seen an animal behave like that before. I walked over to the enclosure and gently slid the glass door open. The dragon continued trying to tap on the glass, even though it was no longer there. For another second or two, and then suddenly its beard went pitch black. It scrambled out of the enclosure and took off across the floor, headed straight for the door. Luckily, my wife was able to close the door before he escaped. Once he reached the door, he started rhythmically tapping on it, the same pattern he had on the glass. Tap, 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 tap. Suddenly, on the other side of the door, we heard another loud thud, even louder than the first one. And, in the same second, the cat started screaming. Not meowing, screaming. It was a horrible sound. But I didn't have time to react before I heard clanging and clattering in the other enclosures behind me. The iguana was wildly whipping its tail against the side of the enclosure and almost hissing. It was a horrifying sight. I quickly picked up the bearded dragon and put him back in his enclosure, where he continued tapping immediately, while my wife grabbed for the doorknob. I'll never forget the fear and disbelief in her voice when she said, "It won't open." I flew to the door and started yanking as hard as I could. The knob wouldn't even turn. Not like it was broken, like someone was holding it from the other side. I started banging on the door and screaming, true panic setting in. My head felt fuzzy and my chest felt tight, and I almost thought I was going to pass out. Then suddenly, it all stopped. The cat stopped screaming, the iguana stopped whipping, the dragon stopped tapping, and the doorknob was easily moved. When we left that room, the rest of the lights in the house were now off. My wife and I bolted out of the house as fast as we could and were silent the whole drive home. The next day, I had almost convinced myself that it was a fluke, and that the animals had upset each other. I talked to my friend to tell her about the weird experience, but she replied, "Oh, I forgot to mention, we've been having activity in the house lately." "What do you mean by activity?" I responded, to which she explained that the former resident of her home had been an elderly man that passed away in the home after owning it for 40 years. She told me that ever since they had started the renovations, she had seen a male figure standing in the corners of the home or at the base of the stairs. That would rile the animals up, and that would often mess with the lights in the house too. She said that she had never seen him be violent, more mischievous, as if he was throwing little fits about the changes that they were making. After that, I reevaluated my whole look and belief on the paranormal. I sure as hell believe now. We all dreamed about her. This is going to be all over the place, but I just want to share something creepy with people who might find it interesting. I had my baby in 2015. When I came home from the hospital with her, I think something dark came back with us. Either that or it was something attached to my ex, her father, because that was when he moved in too. He was a dark person, interested in demons, and he was going through addiction, so I would not be surprised if he brought it. Anyway, shortly after I gave birth, my ex and I noticed a presence in the bedroom we were sleeping with at my parents' house. He heard a female singing voice in there and thought it was the ghost of my grandma, since the room we were sleeping in was hers before she died. Then I started having nightmares about a tall, bony female figure with long, stringy hair. I strongly felt her presence in my room, and I'd see her as soon as I'd close my eyes at night. Before having my baby, the room felt totally normal. I became so afraid of that room that I'd avoid it at all costs until bedtime, and every time I'd open the door, I was expecting to see her there. I didn't tell anyone because I felt crazy, and then my ex started to wake up with scratches all over his chest and back. He mentioned a nightmare about a demonic woman. I asked him to describe to me, and he described the exact same figure I was dreaming about. I continued avoiding the room in the daytime and just dealt with the creepy feelings at night. After I left him, the nightmares started subsiding. One night when my daughter was about a year old, I stayed up all night cleaning and reorganizing things in the living room area. My daughter was upstairs asleep. My parents were also upstairs asleep, and it was 3 a.m. I heard clear as day a woman singing, "Merrily, merrily, 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 life is but a dream," in my bedroom. I thought it was my mom, but she was asleep. My daughter had no toys that sang that song. We moved out a few years later, and there were no more encounters. I actually mostly forgot about her, until some reason last year I had a dream about her again. My husband was away for business, and my daughter slept in the bed with me. In the dream, I was laying in bed with my daughter the same way we fell asleep, except I was in that bedroom in my parents' house. I was facing the closet, and the lady was standing there looking at us. Then I fell asleep in the dream and woke up in another dream, where it became semi-lucid. I knew I was dreaming, but something felt off, and I was uncomfortable, so I shouted, "I want to wake up." I woke up again in the room, and the woman was still there staring at my daughter. I then actually woke up to my daughter crying and shaking me. She said, "Is she real?" My stomach dropped, and I asked, "Is who real?" She said, "The lady." "What lady?" And she goes, "The lady in the bedroom at Pop and Mimi's house." So now I'm wide awake and terrified, and I have questions. I asked what the lady looks like, and she described the same one. Bony, long, dark hair, tall, everything except for one detail. She doesn't have legs, she has wheels instead. I asked if she'd ever seen her at Pop and Mimi's house. She said, "I don't know. I can't remember if it was dreams or if it was real. Is she real?" I told her I don't think she's real, because my daughter is very sensitive and easily scared. So I figured it would just be better if she just forgets. Really freaky. We haven't had any more dreams since. How to contact or communicate with ghosts. So the reason for these questions is that a good friend of mine is experiencing more and more ghost-related stuff at home. It started about 1 or 2 years ago. He lives with his brother and his mother in a very old house. One evening he was alone at home, lying in bed, when he heard a knocking on his door. He thought his family had come home early and asked what was up. He got no response. So he checked the door, and there was no one around. Since then, the knocking came more often and in the evening, but never more than 1 time a night. It knocks 2 or 3 times slowly and then stops. We regularly speak on the phone in the evening and even heard the knocking. He then always goes to check the door, and there's nothing. In case someone's wondering, no, he never asked the ghost to come in or invited it otherwise into his room. So one day he asked his friend about it, if they had something like this too. They both stated that they also had a knocking on their doors frequently. His mother also said that one night she felt something big crawl into her bed. No, they didn't have a cat or any other pets. And last night, his mother was standing in her room when she heard some heavy breathing next to her. It seemed that the ghost is manifesting stronger in the house over time. My friend also said that the knocking got a little bit louder too. I heard from a different friend that if a ghost knocks 3 times, that it stands for the Trinity and a sign of an evil spirit. So since I'm very invested in these events, I was thinking to myself that one could perhaps contact a ghost or prevent it from doing harm to the family. Step into the unknown with Paranormal M, where we dive deep into the unexplainable. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to be the first to know about our latest eerie tales. We can't wait to take you on a journey you won't forget. I think my house is haunted. The title pretty much sums it up. For some background, our neighborhood is full of houses built probably in the 80s. They're not that old, but old enough for some to look abandoned. We don't live in the suburbs or anything. It's a very small neighborhood on top of a low hill, right next to a small forest. We live very close by to each other, so late night parties are a no-no around here. You've got the picture now, so I'll get on with it. I've only moved once, but it was at a very young age. Our old house is right next door. Because I was so young, I'm not sure if there were any occurrences before the move or not. However, I remember a bunch while I've been living here. I'll start with the more regular things. Only at night, I hear footsteps on the roof. They're very clear, quick footsteps, almost as if someone or something is running on the roof. My room is on the second floor, so the roof is right above me. I decided to ask my father about this once, and my sister chimed in, saying she hears it too. I guess he didn't really have an explanation, since he didn't even respond to my question in any other way that wasn't just a chuckle. Another common thing is door handles and doors being constantly flung open and shut. I distinctly remember that our parents' door flung open, not a slow, creaky sound, a swing. The only people in the house were me and my sister, and the dogs were with my dad's wife. Sometimes our things would be misplaced, even completely missing. Maybe that's just our minds playing tricks, but it's way too frequent. Here's the interesting part, I guess. May not be as interesting as you'd expect. It was a few months ago, somewhere during October, I was home alone, which isn't that unusual for me. Parents at work, sisters at practice. The house isn't exactly new, so it makes those creepy sounds you'd hate at night. Well, it was just those sounds that made me walk out of my room. The stairs lead straight to the front door, so I could see from upstairs that it was open. I yelled out for my dad or his wife, even my sister. No answer. I yelled again. Still silence. Annoyed, I make my way down the stairs, only to be shocked by the fact that nobody was in the driveway. I instantly slammed the door shut and began panicking. Was there an intruder inside? A murderer? Or maybe some random homeless person? Well, the first thing my brain told me to do was run back up to my room and stay there until someone got home. I waited there, scared out of my mind that someone would be in the house. When my dad's wife came home, only around 10 minutes later, I told her about it right away. She grabbed a long kitchen knife and stared, searching the house. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. We checked everywhere. Just you name it, the closets, the attic, even the chimney. Nothing. I was frantically sobbing the entire search. Up to this day, everyone swears that they locked the doors after themselves. I knew they did because I always check after they leave. Another incident which happened way back, somewhere in the winter. As per usual, the running sound on the roof was happening again. At this point, we'd been living in this house for almost a year. I got sick of it this time and went downstairs to sleep in my parents' room. I still heard it, it just wasn't as loud. Strangely enough, it wasn't on the roof anymore. The sound was slowly making its way down to the side of the house. I freaked out and saw my parents do so too. They tried to calm me down as my dad went outside to check what it might be. I fell asleep before he came back. So I'm not sure what happened. I've tried asking him, but he won't tell me anything. I still wonder what happened that night. I'd tell you more, but right now I'm just way too tired. I know some of this might sound like it's silly, or things I've been imagining. I thought it was my mind playing tricks, since her family has a history of bad mental health altogether. My dad's wife's side, at least. If anybody has an explanation for any of this, please help me out. Have I invited some sort of spirit? Is it a demon? Or is it something completely different? I don't know. I really just want to get this all off my chest. Visit from my brother. My brother passed away 6 years ago. It was an unexpected death, and it still hurts to this day. We were really close, and it feels like when he died, a part of me died with him. I've been struggling with this tragic loss, and he was always on my mind. I used to dream about him almost every night. Most dreams were wonderful, of our memories and adventures, but some of them were really sad and dark. My last dream about him was around 3 years after his death, but this particular dream was special. It felt so real. It felt different than any other dream I've ever had in my life. In my dream, I was at work and he came over. I was aware that he was dead, so I was really surprised to see him. He said hello and gave me a hug. It actually felt like his hug. I started crying because I knew he was dead. I was happy and confused at the same time. He looked at me and said, "I know it's difficult, but you have to let me go. I can't stay any longer. I love you and I'll always be alive in your heart." After that, he walked out the door and I woke up sobbing. After this, I haven't had any dreams about him whatsoever. It could have been my brain subconsciously telling me that I have to let it go, but it could have been my brother saying goodbye one last time. Mind tricks or ghostly encounter? I would have been about 3 or 5 years old at this time. I wasn't in school yet, but I wasn't using diapers anymore, just underwear. We lived in Arizona in the early 80s. I had my own room, and my parents were in the room next to mine. It would get hot, so I just slept in my underwear, on my stomach. My family was friends with our neighbors who lived in the apartment next to ours. I remember he was a cool guy who was always super nice to me and gave me candy. One time he was working in the attic, and the wood was so bad up there that he fell through into our apartment. It was a mess. Now my dad, like other people in the 80s, was into drinking and doing drugs. He was always good to me, but he did like to go out with his fellas and party from time to time. Our neighbor also liked to party, so they would usually go out together and come back late at night. It seems my dad could handle partying a little and not going overboard, but for our family friend, he wasn't so lucky. I don't know the exact story, but there were 2 rumors on how he died. One was he committed suicide from his drug addiction, and the other was he was killed during a drug deal, and it was made to look like a suicide. Either way, he was found dead near a native reservation hanging by a palm tree. Being so young, I didn't understand what death was. My family and I went to the funeral viewing and the burial. The next week, we visited the grave. I was confused as to why my candy buddy wasn't around anymore. I asked my parents where he was. They told me he was deep in the ground near his headstone. Being a child, I started hopping up and down in his grave, yelling his name and asking if he was down there. Well, my mom didn't like that very much and told me to stop, so I did. That night was just normal, and then it was time for bed. So I'm in my underwear falling asleep on my stomach. It felt like it was right about the time I was about to fall asleep when I heard our family friend whisper my name. I jolted up and looked around, and there was nothing. No other voices, and I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I ran into my parents' room, told them what happened, and slept with them that night. I never slept on my stomach in my underwear after that. I always have a sheet or a blanket now. So that's my story, not much of a ghost story, but to this day, I know it was his voice. I also never jumped on anyone's grave after that either. I lived in a haunted house. Here's a bit of paranormal lore. A major chunk of the population in my birth country believed in the paranormal and black magic, which is why it's believed that a large amount of ghosts and evil spirits reside there, because they're attracted to the community who believe in them. Now for the actual experience. When I was about 6, my family decided to rent a house to live in for a couple months because of the renovations being done at our actual house. When my parents checked out the house, they found it odd. They just had a weird feeling about it, but they decided to rent it anyway. When my dad received the keys, he looked around the house and locked all the doors and windows before he took me and my brother to see it. But when we went outside, he saw the balcony door at the top floor wide open and swinging in the wind. He thought, weird, but maybe he just forgot to close it, so we went back in and closed it. A couple days later, my parents took me and my brother to go check it out and pick out our rooms. We went around and played in the room connected to the aforementioned balcony. While we played, we heard the doors shut and the balcony doors open. We tried opening the doors, but it was locked, though the balcony doors that were closed before are wide open. We yelled to our mom to help us, and she rushed to the room and opened the door with the keys. We were crying and ran to our mom. Our family's Christian. We have a ritual of anointing and praying over a new house we would be living in, with oil to cleanse the place. My parents did this a week later. Afterwards, we moved into the house, and when we did, odd things started happening. One day at night, we heard the sound of grating metal. The next day, we found the metal sink in the kitchen had claw marks on it, as if scratched by an animal. My grandpa's driver, who stayed in the extra room while making house repairs, had a nightmare and woke up. Unable to move, and a large black bear sitting on him. Sleep paralysis, maybe? My dad had a similar experience, being unable to move and seeing a weird figure on the corner. My mom started to get weird spasms when she was holding a knife, and especially only a knife. It would usually result to her dropping the knife, narrowly missing her feet. My brother started seeing weird shadows that looked nothing like objects projecting it. I was really young, but I do remember random weird feelings and noises that would wake me up at night. The housekeepers started getting into accidents like falling more often and glass shattering randomly when they're not even holding glassware. After a week or two of this, my parents figured something was haunting the house and called my grandpa, who was a priest. They did a more in-depth anointing and praying. Even us kids joined in. Afterwards, our stay was mostly peaceful. We moved out after 3 months and a few weeks. A couple years ago, my brother's high school friend moved into that house, becoming our neighbor. Weird things started to happen to them too. Random scratches on the walls and furniture, glass shattering, things falling over, nightmares, etc. Their family believed in the paranormal, so they called a spirit medium over. Usually spirit mediums in my birth country are pretty legit because of the deep black magic influence. The medium talked to the spirit. The spirit said that they were enraged because a couple of years ago they were forced out of the house to the neighbor's home, wreaking havoc until they were able to return 3 months later. The high school friend asked the neighbors about the incident a couple years ago, and they mentioned an episode where the glass coffee table shattered, and her toddler got toppled over by a big bookshelf. He told my brother in passing conversation, and something clicked. The timelines matched up. During our stay, the spirit was forced out of the house due to our right. Not creepy at all, but maybe paranormal. When I was 14 years old, a strange and unforgettable experience occurred when I was walking home from school. It was a typical day, and I was following my usual routine that took about 15 minutes to walk from the bus stop. As I approached my street, I prepared to turn the last corner when I suddenly felt an excruciating pain in the left side of my waist, which was probably the worst pain I'd ever felt up to that point in my life. Despite being a healthy teenager who didn't smoke, drink, and exercise regularly, I almost collapsed on the sidewalk, utterly unable to move forward. It was such an unusual and unexpected occurrence that I couldn't help but laugh at myself, feeling ridiculous for being incapacitated by such a mysterious pain. Eventually, I fell to one knee and found myself unable to stand up again. Strangely enough, the pain vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, and I was able to stand up and proceed to walk home, feeling confused and bewildered. However, I didn't mention the incident to my brother, with whom I was living at the time, or anyone else. By the time I settled down at home for my usual evening of studying and gaming, the ordeal had slipped my mind entirely. It wasn't until the next day that I was reminded of it in the most unexpected way. That evening we received a call from a family friend who was also a neighbor of our grandmother, who lived about 350 kilometers away from us, equivalent to 217 miles. She informed us that her grandmother had stumbled and fallen while tending to her house, and as a result, she broke her pelvic bone. The pain had become unbearable, and she had to be hospitalized the next day. Miraculously, she made a full recovery and lived on for about another 10 years, demonstrating her incredible resilience and strength of character. Intriguingly, when I asked the family friend whether my grandmother had fallen on her left side, she was momentarily taken back before confirming that, indeed, it was her left side that had been injured. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection between my experience and my grandmother's, as if there was some sort of inexplicable link between the two incidents. Nonetheless, I keep this thought to myself and continue to ponder this bizarre coincidence in the years to come. Truth can be stranger than fiction. When I was a preteen or an early teen, I had recurring nightmares involving my maternal grandparents. Their residence would change or be different in many of the dreams, but there'd always be this dark room with an evil presence inside of it, usually on an upper floor. I would usually be frightened to go inside, but a few times I was brave enough to enter, and there would only be darkness there, that malevolent feeling, and sometimes there'd be a mirror. In one particular dream, my family on my mom's side was downstairs, talking and enjoying themselves, while I happened to be exploring in the evil room upstairs. I looked into the mirror, and I saw the reflection of a girl running past me. When I ran downstairs to tell them what I saw, everyone and everything just became dead silent. They were all just looking at me without saying a word, until my mom came up to me, placed her hand on my shoulder, and said, "That girl represents the curse of my past." I rarely had any one of those dreams after that one. Some interesting, albeit creepy real-life facts to consider. After my mom's parents died, my mom, aunts, and myself cleaned up their house, and I happened to find that exact same mirror underneath a bed in a room that when I was younger, my grandfather was still alive, he would always yell and call me out for some reason. Always felt some kind of dark presence in parts of that house and their backyard shack. My grandfather was a Shriner Freemason, and according to my mom, he was very abusive towards her when she was young. She didn't like to talk about it much. Also, when my mom and her two sisters were young, they messed around with a Ouija board once. Hopefully just once, although it takes one time. There's a lot of strange things involving myself and my family, ultimately. I saw pale-colored non-human creatures in my room once when I was really young. I remember hallucinating. If it was a gray alien abduction or abduction attempt, they are said to hypnotize and cause hallucinations with their eyes and bodily movements, and crawling to the door. Then I heard my mother call for me from across the house, and I had enough willpower to go to her. As soon as I exited my room, everything went pitch black for a couple of minutes. My vision was almost gone and my awareness was screwed up. But both came back to me soon after feeling my way down the hallway in my mom's direction. I led her back to my room, but whoever or whatever was there was gone without a trace. Before she died in 2010, she told me that she remembered that occurrence, and for some reason, she was the one to use the word creatures. I'm fairly certain that I'm not being told everything, and I just know deep down that whatever I saw was real. 2 friends I briefly witnessed a V-shaped UFO with in Tulsa. One night back in April 2009. It was huge, seemingly cloaked besides the dim lights, transparent or semi-transparent, slow-moving and completely silent. So far as only unidentified craft I've ever seen, to my knowledge. On a related note, one of my paternal uncles was in the military. He actively researched UFOs for unknown reasons. He's very secretive about such things, and has at least 1 or 2 books about them. Knock on my bedroom's door. In order to provide some context, I must preface this story by explaining that my mother has recently developed a habit of knocking on my wooden door with her nail. Despite our disagreements about this habit, which often terrifies me, especially when she does it on a high glass window, I simply cannot stand that sound. With that being said, here's the story of a strange and unsettling experience I had in my home. It was around 5 p.m., and my mother had just left for my grandmother's house, which meant that I knew she wouldn't be back for at least 3 hours. A few days prior, she had mentioned to me that she hadn't heard me locking my bedroom door, so I decided to keep it open so I could hear her, and because I was busy playing on my laptop in the opposite corner of my bedroom's door. At precisely 7:30 p.m., the main door of our house began to make a trembling noise, and within seconds, I heard the familiar sound of my mother's nail knocking on my door. Without hesitation, I yelled out, "Hey, how was it?" but received no response. Assuming that she had just run upstairs to the bathroom and hadn't heard me, as she does sometimes, I patiently waited to hear her footsteps coming back down. However, when I didn't hear anything, I began to feel a sense of unease creeping over me. As the knocking persisted, I became increasingly frightened and decided not to look back. My nerves were shot, and I was sweating profusely. At this point, I had lost all sense of time. I could only remember the terror I felt as the knocking continued. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the delightful sound of the main gate opening, and my mother's voice announcing her arrival. She turned on the lights, and I immediately ran to hug her, relieved that the ordeal was over. My mother asked me if everything was okay, to which I simply replied yes. However, the experience had left me deeply disturbed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very, very wrong. Even though I had heard the sound of the gate opening and my mother's voice, I still couldn't be certain that it was her knocking on my door earlier. The memory of that night still haunts me to this day, and I can't help but wonder what could have happened if my mother hadn't returned home when she did. A patient of mine keeps seeing the grinning man. I live near San Francisco and work as an LPN at one of the local hospitals. Since we've been short-staffed as of late, I've had to work double shifts for quite a while and often find myself working graveyard. About a month ago, we received a patient whom I'll just call Miguel, as all the identification that anyone has found on him is a pair of worn dog tags. Miguel was found about 20 miles off the coast, just floating, and flown in after being rescued by the Coast Guard. He was sunburned and severely dehydrated. He was wearing one of those green flight suits, and like I said, the only identification we found was a pair of dog tags. Miguel was delirious and for the first 24 hours couldn't speak at all, but he quickly stabilized. He was assigned a bed on my floor and was one of the patients that I attended. Even though Miguel was stable, he was very far from comfortable and would often have panic attacks and ring for the nurse. When any of us would rush in and ask what was wrong, Miguel would just be staring with his eyes wide in fear and would only ever repeat, "He keeps smiling at me." In addition, he would also begin drawing pictures of a weird man with a wide, freakishly large grin, like the Joker, I guess, but even more creepy. We tried to keep Miguel calm, but often he would refuse to go to sleep. We never could get this man to speak more than a few words, and we looked up the name we found on his dog tags, but couldn't find anybody living around the area that matched. The real fear on Miguel's face just gave me goosebumps, and I couldn't get him out of my head. Now, as an LPN, I've seen some strange things and dealt with some very odd patients, but nothing quite like this. After about 7 or 8 days, Miguel was checked out of the hospital by some military guys. My brother-in-law was in the Army for a good number of years, so I know what the uniform looks like, and these guys that checked Miguel out were dressed in full greens. I think that's what you call them. Don't give any background or how they knew Miguel. They just produced some official-looking papers and told us that they had legal authority and that Miguel was coming with them. The hospital had no grounds to hold the patient, so he was released. The military guys took everything, including all the drawings Miguel had made. Afterwards, I did some research online and found that Miguel's drawings strongly resembled what some people call the Grinning Man. This was honestly one of the creepiest encounters I've ever had working at a nursing home, and Miguel is the patient I will probably never forget. I sincerely hope he's okay, wherever they took him. Strange fingers touching me during the night. I don't know what it is or who. Basically, some time ago, I started feeling someone touching me during the night. It's strange, but all this is making me scared and causing a lot of stress during the night, which in turn is causing me to lose my appetite for sleep. There was a time in my adolescence when I was fascinated by extraterrestrials, especially peaceful civilizations. Whenever I had free time, I would always search for articles on the internet and dream about one day talking to them. But all of this built up to a strange feeling inside me, a fear that I can't seem to shake off. At the time, I was dealing with depression and anxiety, which gave me some motivation to ask for help from the universe. As a result, I became a bit closed off and something that I really should have more control over. This led to a time when a girl appeared at my window one night. I had the blinds open, but she was a bit different. I'm sorry, but I don't want to tell too much on here what happened, because I don't want to have a stress attack. But I can say that from then on, things started to change in my life. When the girl appeared, it seemed like she was smiling and about to touch my nose, but I closed my eyes out of fear and told her to leave for safety reasons and because I was too scared. And then she disappeared. Since I told the girl to go away, she didn't touch my nose. With this event, it made me a bit worried and led me to have a brief panic attack. I was already dealing with depression at the time due to a feeling of sadness and self-hatred. Continuing on, lately I've been experiencing some light touches during the night. I don't believe it's my parents, because many times they're already asleep when I have these deep sleeps, believe it or not. Edit. Don't worry, because I've already been to a psychologist to treat my depression, and I'm also taking antidepressants that have been helping me. I've noticed that I've been improving, becoming less worried, and gaining more control over my mind. Here's a tip for those who suffer from depression. Focus on what makes you have a better day, and ignore the negativity, because it won't take you anywhere. Many times I have days without taking antidepressants, and I'm able to have a good control over my confidence. Random palm print of blood. Yesterday I was cleaning my bathroom. I have a pattern where I put the bathroom scrub in the tub and let it sit while I wash and rinse the sink. Then I go to rinse the tub, wipe the outside, and put it in the trash bin, yada yada. So after I finished the sink and counter, I turned my back to it and did a good rinse of the tub. When I turned around, there was a left-hand crescent palm print, like along the outside of the mid-pinky to heel, of blood on the sink counter, with a fresh wet drop in the center of it. My sink counter is white, so it was pretty shocking and was a pretty significant amount of blood. I called my roommate who was cleaning the kitchen, who was sharing the house chore that day, to come have a look. She was nowhere near the bathroom, but came when I asked her to. She was also the only one home besides me. We both looked me over, and I wasn't bleeding. She even checked the back of my head just to be sure. It was thick and partially dried by the time we were content I wasn't bleeding, and I wiped it up. When I turned around again, I start cleaning the toilet. There were 2 streaks of blood on the outside of the trash bin. I had just wiped it down before rinsing the tub. They were fresh but not dripping and looked like fingers smeared it lightly with the tips of fingers. I'm 100% certain that they were not there before that and didn't come from anyone in the house. I double-checked the ceiling and it was clean. My trip to Wales. I know what's more scarier than going to Wales, but still, this is not what I wanted to post on here. I have way scarier and more realistic stories about the supernatural, normally surrounding the more generic side of it. But I don't know where else to post this, and well, this seems more the right place to do so. You don't have to believe me, but I need to just say this. It seems must have been a reason for this. Hopefully I'll find an answer here. May 17th, 2022, 6 a.m. My alarm has just woken me up. My friend Joe is waiting outside for me in his car, and we're just about to leave to go to our friend Luan's in Wales. We've been friends for about 4 years up until this point, and we had met on a Zoom call with our management team for acting, and we're paired up for an improv class. And well, we got on very well. We became friends very quickly and decided to add each other on Discord that same night and began to play Sea of Thieves. We haven't stopped talking since, so when Joe passed his driving test, we instantly made plans to go see our third member in Wales. The car journey for the first 45 minutes was great. We had snacks, drinks, and began wondering what was going to happen when we went down there. Joe mentioned the very generic and albeit stupid remark of, "They do shag sheep down there, right?" and laughed and mentioned we'll just have to wait and see. We ended up making the rest of the way go quite smoothly, listening to music and trying to guess what each sign in Welsh meant. Until it hit us. We were extremely early, and it was now 10 a.m. And I didn't want to finish until 2, and we would be at his house in 15 minutes. We couldn't just wait outside for that long. We had just done a straight 4-hour journey, and we were desperate to get walking, so that's what we did. What I'm about to say is the main reason why I'm making this post. May 17th, 2022, 10 p.m. It was still really early, however most of the shops were open. And also, McDonald's. We got our double sausage egg McMuffins and began walking. The town seemed like it was stuck in a 2010 time warp. Everything seemed dated and worn out. We began walking into the town center. I don't know how else to explain it, but it looked like a mall from Stranger Things, but without the cool lights, cool aesthetic, and no secret Russians, sadly. Anyway, we walked out back, as at that time there was really nothing to see until we actually saw a building that looked like it was being rebuilt, but looked like they had given up straight away. There was still power tools, albeit covered in rust, and workers' radios surrounded by scaffolding, but they seemed like they hadn't been touched in ages. I jokingly said, "Let's take it." But Joe summarized that builders normally leave their stuff on site, and that's just another party, another building company. And they would not be turning up. As soon as we stopped away, we saw a door open in the left side of the building. "Let's go," I said. Joe had never been the guy to explore abandoned buildings, unlike me, even if it was just unattended. I begged for a good 20 minutes and described how cool his Instagram story would look with the pictures we could take inside of the place, and then he couldn't decline. May 17th, 2022, 10:20. The inside was hanging by threads. Quick fixes to the interiors, stability as far as the eye could see. Joe began taking photos of the place, but the lighting was so horrific with all the tarps covering windows it made it seem like we were underground. Seriously, it was that dark. There were 2 floors we could visibly see, but not enough. We saw some floodlights near the stairs and whacked them on, and fucking hell did it turn into a whole new area. This place used to be a second part of the mall, but just not connected. It was insane until someone from the corner appeared. They looked homeless, and, well, it was evidently clear by the smell, but not a normal smell. It was a horrific, don't get me wrong, but me and Joe had never smelt something like it before. We shouted, "Hello." Twice over, we began using the generic, "We're taking photos, we'll be out in 15 minutes. He didn't say anything and began to look more confused than angry like he did earlier. I started shitting myself at this point. I'm normally a confident guy, but fuck, this was terrifying. I asked, "How long has this place been abandoned?" There was a long silence before he answered. 23 years. How did you end up in here? There's a reason why this place is locked up." We mentioned that the door was open and that we hadn't broken anything. He was still hiding in the corner. "Why don't you come out so you can show us around? Then you can keep an eye on what we're doing," Joe said. And again, silence. At this point, I had texted Joe on my phone mentioning, "What if there's others?" And almost if he had been looking over my shoulder, he shouted, "It's just me," and let out a belly laugh. Me and Joe looked at him wide-eyed. Joe still thinks it was a coincidence and that he said it because he saw us texting and guessed that that's what we were talking about. But fuck that. It was on cue. As soon as I sent it to Joe's phone, he said it. It freaked me out. We began to walk away and he looked back and he was staring back at us, watching. He primarily, maybe because I looked more on edge, he didn't think he was violent, and to be honest, we knew we could handle him. We both picked up a plank of wood just in case. We had been in there for a span of 10 minutes and already we wanted to leave. But we couldn't, I think due to the fact that we were both 20. And we just got the shit scared of us by someone who looked like Smeagol wanting his precious back, and we didn't leave. I began climbing the stairs. The stairs were creaking. We looked back and the man was gone. We both sighed and believed he had just left and carried on with his day. The second floor was covered in dust, except for certain areas and rooms. Just the corners. We laughed and thought how weird it looked. Even the surrounding walls were covered in dust. It really made no sense. After the whole ordeal, we glanced over, and it was something small. But we shouldn't have. The next room was filled with paintings and various different shaped mirrors. It felt uneasy and like something was on my chest. And I began to cry, not like sobbing, but just a few tears. Joe noticed and wondered if I was joking, but I wasn't. I felt scared and worried and a bit overwhelmed. As soon as I went into that room, we left into the next room, and it had a floodlight in it. It felt safe, and I told Joe that it must have been the dust. But dust doesn't make you feel like that. It made me feel mortified, like I just saw someone I loved die. I never told Joe this at the time. Joe mentioned to go, but I didn't know if the guy downstairs had returned to where he was, or even worse, if he was waiting at the way we came in. I mentioned that the next floor had a balcony, and we could double check. May 17th, 2022, 11:55. Now you're probably wondering why I'm pushing the timestamps. Well, we'll get into it in a second. It's important and makes the whole situation much weirder. We went upstairs and looked up the balcony. Thankfully, the coast was clear, so we began our descent. This time, though, everything changed. The corners of the rooms had footmarks coming out from them, and only coming out of them. Mine and Joe's footmarks were still visibly clear, and we both swore we had not done this as a joke. Besides, we were wearing shoes. Whoever made these marks were not, and they were very fresh. We began exclaiming that the guy downstairs must have done it. Let's just say our pace this time was much faster than before. We got downstairs in record time. We struggled with the door until we noticed this door was stuck, unlike before. Now, it wasn't stuck with an object or anything we could visibly see. We began booting it and throwing shit at it. Our wooden beams didn't do shit to it. We tried 20 minutes until we reluctantly gave up. It wasn't budging, so we had to look somewhere else. When looking, we saw 2 doors leading outside. Now remember, there was two, and they're cemented into the wall. Nothing could have made them move. No one was there to remove them, okay? We went through the exit to the right, and we were outside, finally. We went to shut the door, and I noticed something. Looking down to the first level, our front door that we went through was now open. And now the man was on the stairs, and we could visibly see him now. I wish we took a photo, but I'll try to describe in best detail what I was looking at. He covered himself in what seemed like red paint. He had a brown leather jacket and had only pants on. His feet seemed mangled, and I was surprised that he was standing. And the worst part of his feet didn't match the ones I saw in the dust upstairs. The feet upstairs were around 5 or 6, and well, he was missing 2 fucking toes, and the dust prints were perfect, symmetrical and seemed staged. If that makes sense, I said to him before leaving. Fucking hell, how'd you get that door open? Us 2 couldn't. He looked upset and almost on the verge of tears, and in a grunted voice he mentioned that he never shut it. Well, after that, we both said goodbye and left. May 17th, 2022, 2:15. We had made it back to the car, and we were on our way to pick Luan up from work. We were relieved, but we were upset that we didn't take any photos. But there was no way we were going back in there. We grabbed Luan, had a bite to eat, had a few beers, and headed back to the hotel, with our friend with us. Now we already told him what had happened, and where it was, and he mentioned how strange it was, and how it was probably some crack den. It didn't explain the room, why I cried, and the footprints and the door not opening. But you know what? It doesn't matter. It made us all laugh, and then we fell asleep. May 18th, 2022, 9 a.m. This time, Joe wakes me up, and he said he wants to show Luan where the place was, and I fucking hated the idea. It was a creepy place, and well, I wasn't happy that he would even mention going back at all after we saw what happened in that room. But it was only showing the place, not going in, and I was fine with that. We met up near an ice cream shop and walked towards the building, whilst reiterating that we had experienced this thing. Now the builder's gear was gone. Now this doesn't seem weird to me, I just thought I'd add it. The door was slightly open, and Luan mentioned about going in, but I refused. But Joe said that Luan can at least poke his head in. I didn't see any problem with that. But it was dark as shit, and it looked like you were buried alive, nothing, just darkness. Yeah, and look down to the left. That's how me and Joe got out, I said. He was saying where and saying, liars, there's nothing down there. So I looked in there too, but lo and behold, there was nothing. Fucking nothing, only 2 walls. I'm writing this now and I still feel sick thinking about that door. I went through it, and I literally pushed and walked out and shut. Was now not there. I was feeling ill. Did I imagine it? I must be going insane. Joe thought it must have been a different set of doors, but it was different than that one. Then Luan mentioned something else. How long were you in there for? Since 10, I said. Well, what were you doing? Luan said. There's fucking nothing in here. I pushed past Luan and he was right. There was nothing. Rubble, leftover tools. And well, that second floor, there was no way up to it. It had been cordoned off. The line of tape covering the balcony said keep away, hard helmet required entering this zone. I told Joe to take a look and he was distraught as I was. We both fell down and began telling Luan that we ended up there and saw the rooms, but he believed us. I think the falling on our asses down to the floor proved we were bullshitting. There was no man in there, no second floor, and those fucking doors that I swore I went through were gone. After that, we went home. That was it. We spent the rest of the car journey trying to find ways to explain it, but we couldn't. And that made it even scarier. What were we doing there for nearly 2 or 3 hours? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Who was the man in there? The footprints in the room, the door locking, and the 2 doors that were never there, apparently. It makes it easier to say this was a carbon monoxide thing, but I checked the place out in forums, and it's not been running for 23 years. Like the guy said, there's no running gas mains, nothing. Hopefully this gains attention. I want to feel less scared and less worried that I was in control of my own thoughts for those 3 hours. Allow me to elaborate on a fascinating and eerie experience that my family went through. As the youngest of 2 older brothers, I've always been familiar with stories about my middle brother who had passed away in 2005. However, one incident in particular stands out in my mind, which involves one of my cousins who had given birth to a boy a few years later. The child had never met or heard of my brother before, as he passed away before the child was born. Fast forward a few more years when the boy is old enough to talk. I believe around the age of 5. My aunt had informed my mother that her son had been talking about an imaginary friend named Michael. At first, both my aunt and my mother thought it was just a harmless childhood imagination. However, my aunt began explaining some eerie coincidences that directly related to my deceased brother. According to my aunt, Michael would wake up the boy in the middle of the night wanting to play basketball. Although the child didn't mind playing, it was peculiar that the imaginary friend would want to play basketball in the middle of the night. Another strange coincidence was that Michael would tell the child that he had an owie and point to his throat. It was later discovered that my brother had a throat injury before his passing. The spookiest part of the story occurred when my mother went to visit my aunt. While sitting on the couch watching TV, my cousin and her son walked in. The child was hesitant at first, and then walked back to his room. My cousin then approached my mother and said, "He was being shy because he told me that that's Michael's mom." It was then revealed that if you show the child a photo of my brother, he points to it and says, "That's Michael." Even when I visited their house, the child did the same thing, and this time, my cousin said, he whispered to me saying, "That's Michael's brother." The most chilling coincidence of all is that my brother's name was Travis Michael, with the last name redacted. Not only did he enjoy playing basketball in high school, but he also passed away from a freak accident at the Obispo sand dunes while riding an ATV. The accident had shattered his Adam's apple, ultimately suffocating him. It's difficult to explain these eerie coincidences, but it's comforting to think that my brother may be watching over us, at least in some way. This happened just the other night. I don't think there's anything paranormal about it, but I can't explain it. I live in a dense part of town, near what we call the town center. This happened just the other night. I don't think there's anything paranormal about it, but I just can't explain it. I live in a dense part of town near what we call the town center. Big, well-lit streets, lots of businesses, lots of lights, a mall, large hospital, and a nice suburban area tucked behind it all. So it's not spooky to drive or even walk at night. And I often take a late night drive to the grocery store and go shopping, and it's open 24/7, no lines, and a great deli. I'm driving along and notice a woman walking the opposite direction that I'm driving, on the sidewalk. Like I mentioned, the area is well lit at night. I get a good look at her, early 20s, long brown hair, wearing some kind of Burberry scarf and a tan sweater, tight dark pants, brown boots. I remember thinking she looked a little bit too well dressed to be walking down that particular part of the city street at 11 p.m., but whatever. Maybe she drank too much at one of those many restaurants or comedy clubs about 20-minute walk away and decided to walk home. I've done it. As I pass, she looks up, right at me. We make eye contact. About 10 minutes later, I reach the grocery store in question. I walk into the entrance and retrieve a basket. I notice someone exiting, so I move to the other side and let them pass. I look up and I swear it was the same woman. She glances at me and grins, but keeps walking. I stood there dumbfounded as she rounds the corner out of sight. I took a few steps into the store, responded to the greeting of a passing worker without really processing what they said, then decided to quickly walk back outside and see where she went. Despite the parking lot being very large and very well lit, the only cars being mine and the two that were there when I arrived, I saw no one. It could have been another woman that looked remarkably similar and had the same taste in clothes. That's what I figure. But it was weird as hell to experience all the same. My good friend shared this story with me, and I've never been able to shake it, or retell it. It's a long story, so I'll just tell you the first part, which I find to be the scariest. He's about 40 and divorced. Back when he was married with a 1-year-old daughter, he and his wife bought a house and moved in an apparently old house that needed some fixing up, but they had a good deal and they were ready for the work. After a week or so, he notices a life-size doll in the corner of the nursery where his daughter sleeps. It creeps him out because he's a normal human being, so he turns it around to face the corner so it stops staring at him. After putting the kid to bed, he goes downstairs and asks his wife about it. "Where did we get that doll?" She looks at him and says, "I don't remember. I assume someone gave it to you for your daughter after we moved in here." He's a little weirded out because he didn't remember moving the doll and wonders if maybe it was the house when it moved in here and he didn't notice it. The next morning, he goes to get the kid out of her crib and notices something. The doll isn't facing the corner anymore. It's looking at him again. I'm getting shivers already just remembering him tell me this. That's enough to creep anyone out, so he throws it in the closet, shuts the door. That night, he has an argument with his wife. I don't remember what it was about, and it's probably not really relevant. But the point is, they were getting into it a bit, loud, and focused enough that they didn't notice their daughters crying upstairs. At a lull in the argument, his wife hears and he says that he's going to go check on her, but he just tells her she'll be fine. Let's hash this out. Another minute goes by and suddenly he realizes he's practically having to shout over the noise of his daughter screaming from her room. It sounds different. It's not a normal cry. He glances at his wife and quickly starts up the stairs. What he saw when he opened the door literally makes my eyes water with fear when I think about it. The closet door is open. The life-size doll is sitting next to the crib, motionless, and his arms are reaching through the bars toward his daughter, just stiff and motionless, like it was caught in the act before returning to doll state. Needless to say, the doll was thrown out, and I believe even burned. There's no explanation for that, other than something seriously demonic. Let me tell you a spine-tingling tale that will make your hair stand on end. It happened to me a few years ago, but the memory's still as vivid as ever. You see, I've always been fascinated by the paranormal. The shows, movies, books, you name it. Little did I know that my love for the supernatural would lead me down a path of terror. It all started with a sleep paralysis dream. I remember watching those spooky shows before bed, and it must have seeped into my subconscious. In the dream, I found myself transported back to the time of the 1940s and 50s, dressed in full nurse attire, pin-up hair, dark red lipstick, the works. But it wasn't a dreamy nostalgia trip. Instead, I was confronted with a sinister scenario. There was an overweight woman who was trying to kill her elderly patients to put them out of their misery. She wanted me to do the same, but I refused. Her piercing green eyes still haunt me to this day. Suddenly I wake up, unable to move my body, and that's when I saw her. The ghostly figure with the green eyes hovering above me. But this was not the only time I encountered something supernatural. When I was a kid, I shared a bed with my sister. We had a mirror near the end of the room, and I woke up to see a figure sitting in front of it. I assumed it was my sister, but when I asked her what she was doing, she didn't respond. Instead, I saw a skull with burning hair staring back at me through the reflection. My sister was sound asleep next to me, and this figure was right in front of us, just a foot away. I was so scared that I jumped back into bed and squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away. These unexplained incidents left me with a sense of dread and curiosity about the supernatural world. I'm still drawn to it, but now I'm more cautious about what I wish for. I don't want to summon any more ghostly encounters into my life. When I was in high school, I decided it would be a good idea to visit the local cemetery and clean graves. This was an old cemetery with graves from the early 1800s. Many of them had long since become overgrown and unreadable. It was a lot of fun at the time, except it honestly was the worst decision ever. Anyways, I went home and my older sister began having vivid nightmares. She never told me what they were about until after the whole incident was resolved. We were having identical ones involving the same figure. Anyways, they stopped within the week. This was after my dad put some type of oil under her bed without telling her. However, the nightmares just moved on to me. I began having vivid dreams that I was being raped by a tall Caucasian man with blonde hair and green eyes. It was very, very, very vivid, as in there were smells, sensations, sounds, and so on. And I was a 14-year-old female virgin, and I was still sheltered enough not to know what sex was or even how it worked. It happened every single day for an entire month. The setting would change, except the same man would be in my dreams. It got to the point that I always became lucid as soon as I saw him and tried to hide. During that month, I pretty don't quite remember anymore, except I was just tired. There was some shape or shadow, and it always seemed to be around. It seemed to get darker as the month wore on. The main sensation while I was awake was of being heavy. I don't really remember the whole thing much now. Anyways, my dad used the same oil that he used with my sister in an attempt to make the spirit leave. It didn't leave, and it just followed me around instead, but from a distance though, which is where I could clearly identify that it looked like a woman. We managed to ditch it in the middle of a parking lot on some harebrained idea. I don't remember what we did, except it was gone. All that mattered to me was that the dream stopped. presence in my childhood and dreams. I've had this feeling as long as I can remember. I used to be a terrified kid who had nightmares and would sleep on my mom's floor for safety. I'm posting today because it visited me again last night in my dreams. My whole life I felt as though something is trying to entice me or call me to it. As a kid, I felt like it was more physical, standing in the corner of my room, in the little conjoined bathroom, or in the closet down the hall. I had to sleep with all the doors shut and the TV on. I even got a trundle to be there so no chance something was under it. I don't remember the dreams as a kid so much, but I'm sure they were there. I'm a lucid dreamer and have clear memory most mornings of my dreams, which brings me to last night. I had dreamt that I was roaming at night through places in my childhood, very recognizable places. First, I was on my aunt's cul-de-sac, wandering through the house and across the street from hers. The house glowed blue like a TV screen, and a red laser shot across. I imagined it was a trip sensor for an alarm system. The front door was open, and I felt a dark black shadow beckoning me in. I don't remember walking toward the house, but found myself waking out of it to find the neighbor at that door. I've never met the neighbor, but he had a human form and a face that I didn't recognize. The dream switched to a party at a house I've never been to. I was wandering with a high school friend, seeming to try to explain to her this demon that follows me at night. Last, it switches to my high school. It was night, and I'd been at my high school at night with a handful of friends. A small group of students were leaving. I'd said in my dream, Mom says to meet her at the bus stop, so I'm safe. I stood at the bus stop and kept feeling the urge to look back at the empty school. The same creature, a black shadow, nearly saying words in my head, tried to call me back to the school gate. I was turned away from the bus, and though it wasn't meant to get on, my jacket got snagged on the bus door and I got tugged in. They seem to only be childhood places and never include college or my husband or our new homes. Thanks for reading. Let me know what you think, and if there's any threads I should share my story with.